I thought my husband and his brother were playing a twisted game when they left me stranded at a desolate rest stop 99 miles from nowhere. Find your own way back. They laughed as the tires kicked up a thick cloud of blinding red dust. I never came home. 3 years later, he finally found me with 41 desperate messages waiting on a secure server he was never supposed to know about. Before I share exactly how I dismantled his entire life and took everything he valued, tell me where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit the like button and subscribe if you have ever had to quietly rebuild your life after being discarded by the people who swore to protect you. The atmosphere inside Andre's leased luxury sport utility vehicle was thick and suffocating, heavier than the brutal Georgia summer heat baking the asphalt outside. We had been driving for 3 hours toward a family cabin retreat in the mountains, and for every single minute of that journey, the tension had been slowly wrapping around my throat like a vice. Andre gripped the leather steering wheel with white knuckles, his jaw clenched tight as he stared at the endless stretch of pine trees. He loved this vehicle because it projected the exact image he desperately craved. As a mid-level sales manager at a struggling technology firm, Andre spent his days drowning in credit card debt just to maintain the illusion of overwhelming success. The car the designer watches the extravagant bar tabs. All of it was a fragile house of cards held together by minimum monthly payments and his towering, fragile ego. Sitting in the passenger seat next to him was Julian, his older brother. Julian was the master architect of Andre's worst impulses, an enabler who fed off his younger brother's desperate need for approval. But the real source of the suffocating tension radiating through the vehicle came from the back seat right beside me. Chloe, Julian's wife, had been complaining since the moment we pulled out of our driveway in Atlanta. Chloe was white, profoundly entitled, and possessed a remarkable talent for weaponizing her own fragility to control every African-American member of my husband's family. Beatrice, my mother-in-law, practically worshipped the ground Chloe walked on, constantly praising her delicate nature while treating me like the unpaid family assistant whose only purpose was to carry the emotional and financial burdens of her sons. The argument that sparked this silent, hostile car ride had been brewing for weeks. Chloe had demanded the master suite at the mountain cabin, insisting her delicate back required the soaking tub and the premium mattress. The property management company required a massive upgrade fee for access to that specific wing of the estate. Julian's finances were a closely guarded disaster, and Andre was already overdrawn on 3 different accounts. So naturally, the expectation fell squarely on my shoulders. They expected me, the quiet former accountant, to drain my personal savings to subsidize Chloe's luxury weekend. When I firmly and calmly refused to pay the upgrade fee, the entire family dynamic imploded. Chloe immediately deployed her favorite tactic. She shrank back into her seat, letting large silent tears roll down her cheeks, acting as though my financial boundary was a vicious personal attack on her well-being. Julian had immediately wrapped his arm around her, glaring at me through the rearview mirror as if I had physically struck his wife. Andre, terrified of losing his brother's respect and entirely incapable of standing up to Chloe's manipulative tears, turned his misplaced rage onto me. He spent the first hour of the drive lecturing me about family loyalty, accusing me of being selfish, miserable, and fundamentally incapable of being a supportive wife. I did not raise my voice. I did not argue back. I simply sat in the back seat watching the highway blur past, wrapped in a protective silence that only infuriated him more. My silence was not submission. It was a calculated preservation of my energy. For 4 grueling years, I had played the role of the small, obedient accountant wife, while Andre paraded around pretending to be the breadwinner. He loved mocking my late nights at the computer, constantly belittling my work. He genuinely believed I was running a pathetic little budget advice blog for housewives trying to save money on groceries. He had no idea that my simple budget blog was actually the front for Apex Ledger, a revolutionary financial technology algorithm I had been painstakingly coding and testing in the shadows. While he spent his weekends drinking on the golf course to impress men who did not care about him, I had been quietly building a platform designed to dismantle predatory lending practices and empower millions of users with automated financial literacy. I was exhausted from hiding my brilliance to accommodate his insecurity, and that exhaustion made me perfectly numb to his temper tantrums. The highway eventually narrowed into a desolate two-lane road surrounded by dense, overgrown woods. We were 99 miles outside the city, completely disconnected from civilization, when Andre suddenly slammed on the brakes. The heavy vehicle swerved onto the gravel shoulder, pulling into a dilapidated rest stop. It was not a modern travel plaza with bright lights and coffee shops. It was nothing more than a cracked patch of asphalt, a overflowing trash can, and a cinderblock restroom covered in faded graffiti. The afternoon sun was beating down with merciless intensity, creating wavy lines of heat distortion rising off the pavement. Andre shoved the gear shift into park and let out a heavy sigh, running a hand over his face. He refused to look at me in the rearview mirror. I assumed we were just stopping for a bathroom break, eager to escape the stifling negativity trapped inside the car. I unbuckled my seatbelt and pushed the heavy door open. The moment my sneakers hit the loose gravel, the Georgia heat hit me like a physical blow, thick and smelling of hot tar and dry pine needles. I took 3 steps away from the vehicle, rolling my shoulders to release the tension of the miserable drive. Then I heard the sound. It was a sharp mechanical clunk that echoed loudly in the quiet, empty air. The sound of all 4 doors locking simultaneously. I stopped walking and turned around, confusion slowly morphing into a cold, sharp realization. The tinted window of the driver's side slowly rolled down just a few inches, letting a blast of the heavily air-conditioned interior escape into the sweltering heat. Andre looked at me through the narrow gap. His face was twisted into a cruel, arrogant sneer, an expression he reserved specifically for moments when he needed to feel powerful by making me feel small. In the front passenger seat, Julian shifted his weight, resting his arm on the center console with a look of absolute amusement. Chloe leaned forward from the back seat, pressing her face near the gap in the window. She was no longer crying. The fragile, wounded victim routine had completely vanished. Her tears had evaporated, replaced by a triumphant, malicious smirk that told me she had orchestrated this exact moment. She looked at me like I was an insect they were finally scraping off their shoe. "Chloe is completely stressed out by your negative energy," Maya Andre said, his voice dripping with condescension and performative authority for his brother's benefit. "You are ruining this entire trip for the family. You need a serious timeout to think about your attitude. Find your own way back to the city." Julian barked a loud, cruel laugh, slapping the leather dashboard. "You hear that? Good luck getting a signal out here?" He taunted, thoroughly enjoying the spectacle of my humiliation. I did not scream. I did not run to the door and pull on the locked handle. I did not beg my husband to let me back into the air conditioning. I stood perfectly still in the oppressive, suffocating heat, the gravel crunching softly under my shoes, and I simply stared at the man I had married. I looked at the weakness in his eyes, the pathetic desperation of a man who would abandon his wife on a dangerous, empty highway just to earn a fleeting moment of approval from his toxic brother and his manipulative sister-in-law. Andre broke eye contact first, unable to hold my steady, unbothered gaze. He reached down and popped the trunk. The heavy rear door lifted slowly with an electronic hum. He stepped out of the driver's seat, walked to the back, and grabbed my cheap, faded canvas duffel bag. He did not hand it to me. He lifted it and threw it directly into the red dirt at my feet. It landed with a heavy, humiliating thud, kicking up a cloud of dust that coated my ankles. "Maybe you can use that little budget blog of yours to pay for a ride back to the city." Andre laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that hung in the humid air. He turned his back on me, climbed back into the driver's seat, and rolled the window up tightly, sealing himself inside his leased fortress of fake wealth. That single insult was his absolute favorite weapon. It was the ultimate proof of his profound ignorance. He truly believed he was leaving a helpless, dependent woman stranded in the dirt, entirely unaware that the woman he was discarding was already a titan in the making. He had no idea that my little budget blog had secured a massive round of venture capital funding just 3 weeks ago. He had no idea that I possessed more wealth, power, and leverage in my quiet mind than his entire family lineage combined. The engine roared to life. The heavy tires spun aggressively in the gravel, spitting small rocks and a massive cloud of thick red dust directly into my face. I stood my ground as the vehicle peeled out onto the empty highway. I watched the red taillights grow smaller and smaller until they completely disappeared around a bend in the dense forest, leaving me entirely alone in the blinding afternoon sun. I was 35 years old. I was completely abandoned by my husband and his family. I was stranded on a desolate highway 99 miles from civilization, miles away from a single gas station or passing car. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. The screen was dim, flashing a critical warning that the battery was at exactly 4%. One wrong move, one wasted phone call, and the device would die completely, leaving me completely cut off from the world. I did not shed a single tear. I did not feel an ounce of panic. I slowly reached down, picked up the straps of my dusty canvas duffel bag, and brushed the red dirt off the fabric. I unlocked my dying phone. I did not open a standard commercial rideshare application. I certainly did not call my mother-in-law to beg for an intervention. Instead, I opened a highly encrypted hidden corporate application that Andre did not even know existed on my device. With 3% battery remaining, I pressed a single button to summon a private executive black car transport, fully paid for by the venture capital seed fund I controlled in absolute secrecy. The confirmation screen glowed, indicating a driver was already en route to my exact GPS coordinates. I locked the screen, slipped the phone back into my pocket, and smiled into the empty, sweltering air, knowing that my husband had just made the final, most catastrophic mistake of his entire life. The blistering Georgia heat radiated from the cracked asphalt, pressing down on my shoulders like a physical weight. I stood perfectly still as the thick cloud of red dust kicked up by my husband's tires slowly settled over my sneakers and my cheap canvas duffel bag. The silence of the abandoned rest stop was absolute, broken only by the harsh buzzing of cicadas hidden deep within the wall of overgrown pine trees. 99 miles from the city center. That was the exact distance Andre had calculated would break my spirit. He wanted me to panic. He expected me to cry, to scream into the empty wilderness, to feel the crushing weight of my own helplessness. Instead, I felt an overwhelming wave of clarity wash over me. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my phone. The battery icon flashed an ominous warning showing exactly 4% remaining. A normal person in my situation would have called the police or a family member, or perhaps begged an expensive commercial ride service to venture out into the middle of nowhere. I was no longer a normal person. For the past 4 years, I had played the role of the quiet, submissive accountant wife. I had allowed Andre to mock my late-night coding sessions. I had let his family treat me like an unpaid assistant. I had swallowed my pride to keep the peace. That version of Maya died the moment Andre locked those car doors. With 3% battery left, I opened a highly secure proprietary application hidden deep within my phone folders. My lead developer had custom-built this interface specifically for our new executive team. I bypassed the standard rideshare options entirely and accessed the Black Car Concierge service. This account was directly linked to the venture capital seed fund I had quietly secured exactly 21 days ago. I pressed the request button, transmitting my exact global positioning coordinates. I locked the screen and slipped the dying device back into my pocket. I did not pace. I did not seek shade. I simply stood by my dusty bag and waited. Exactly 20 minutes later, the distinct sound of heavy tires crushing gravel broke the heavy silence. A pristine, midnight black Lincoln Navigator pulled into the desolate dirt lot, looking completely alien against the backdrop of graffiti-covered cinder blocks and overflowing trash cans. The driver, a tall man dressed in an immaculate dark suit, stepped out of the vehicle. He assessed the scene, noting my dusty clothes and the cheap bag resting in the dirt. He did not ask a single question. He simply picked up the duffel bag, placed it gently into the spacious rear trunk, and opened the passenger door for me. I slid into the expansive leather interior. The blast of air conditioning was instantaneous, cooling my overheated skin and clearing the smell of hot tar from my lungs. The driver offered me a bottle of chilled sparkling water and gestured toward a charging cable resting on the center console. I accepted the water and plugged in my phone. As the screen flickered back to life, the driver caught my eye in the rearview mirror and asked for my destination. I did not give him the address of the luxury mountain cabin where my husband and his toxic family were currently heading. I gave him the address of our apartment building in downtown Atlanta. The driver nodded, merged the heavy vehicle back onto the desolate highway, and smoothly raised the soundproof privacy partition. As the car accelerated toward the city, my phone vibrated against the leather console. A new voicemail notification appeared on the screen. It was from Beatrice, my mother-in-law. I pressed play, holding the device close to my ear. The familiar grating tone of her voice filled the quiet space of the back seat. She did not ask if I was safe. She did not express concern that her son had left his wife stranded on a dangerous empty highway in the middle of a blistering summer afternoon. Beatrice was calling to scold me. Maya, Andre just called me. She began, her words dripping with absolute condescension. He told me you threw a massive temper tantrum and completely ruined Chloe's peaceful weekend with your negative attitude. I am incredibly disappointed in you, but I cannot say I am surprised. You always have to make everything about yourself. When Andre graciously comes back to get you, you need to apologize to him immediately. You also owe Chloe a sincere apology for causing her so much stress. Do not embarrass this family any further. I listened to the entire message without blinking, my face perfectly neutral. This was the same woman who had demanded I cater her 50th birthday party for free, claiming my accounting job was not real work anyway. This was the matriarch who had watched her oldest son Julian financially drain my husband for years. Yet she constantly praised Julian's imaginary business acumen while openly mocking my frugal lifestyle. Beatrice had constructed a toxic family hierarchy based entirely on delusions of grandeur, and she had placed me firmly at the absolute bottom to serve as a footstool for her golden children. She expected me to grovel. She expected me to be grateful that her son might eventually return to rescue me from the dirt. I did not save the voicemail to use as leverage. I simply hit delete. I watched the digital trash can icon swallow her voice forever, erasing her authority over my life with a single tap of my finger. The drive back to Atlanta took 2 hours. I watched the dense, dark pine forests gradually give way to suburban sprawl, and finally, the towering glass skyline of the city. While the tires hummed against the smooth asphalt, my mind shifted away from the miserable family I was leaving behind and focused entirely on the empire I was building. I thought about the seed money sitting untouched in my secure corporate accounts. $2.5 million. That was the initial valuation my algorithm had secured from the most ruthless and discerning venture capitalists in Silicon Valley. They had looked at the raw code of Apex Ledger. They had analyzed the predictive financial models I had built from scratch at my kitchen table between the hours of midnight and 4 in the morning. They recognized immediately that I had created a platform capable of dismantling predatory lending practices and empowering millions of users with automated financial literacy. They had offered me a fortune on the spot. Andre thought I was running a pathetic blog sharing grocery coupons for bored housewives. He had laughed at me just last week, aggressively telling me I was wasting electricity by keeping my computer monitor on so late at night. I had smiled and agreed with him, knowing perfectly well that the ink was already drying on my multi-million-dollar term sheets. The black car pulled smoothly up to the curb outside my upscale apartment building. I thanked the driver, retrieved my dusty duffel bag from the trunk, and walked through the gleaming glass lobby doors. The concierge nodded to me politely, entirely unaware that the woman walking past his desk was no longer the quiet wife he was used to seeing. I rode the elevator up to the 14th floor in absolute peaceful silence. As I walked down the carpeted hallway toward my door, my phone lit up with a new text message notification. 3 hours had passed since they left me at the rest stop. It was from Andre. I opened the message and read the words he had typed while sitting comfortably in the mountain cabin I had planned and packed for. Hope you learned your lesson out there. We will swing back to get you tomorrow morning on our way to the lake. Do not wander off. I read the message twice, letting the sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it wash over me. He truly believed he was the one teaching a lesson. He genuinely thought I would spend the entire night trembling in the dirt at that rest stop crying and waiting for him to graciously return and rescue me. He was completely delusional, intoxicated by a false sense of power he had never actually possessed. I did not reply to his text. I did not block his number yet. I smiled as I slipped the phone back into my pocket. I pulled my keys from my bag and unlocked the front door of our apartment. I stepped inside the quiet, familiar space where I had spent years making myself small to accommodate his massive ego. I walked straight past the living room, opened the hall closet, and pulled out an empty hard-shell suitcase. The metallic zip of the hard-shell suitcase echoed through the silent hallway. I laid it open on the hardwood floor and stood up, taking a long, calculated look at the apartment I had shared with Andre for the past 4 years. To anyone else walking through the front door, the space looked like a temple of modern success. White leather sectionals dominated the living room. A massive flat-screen television hung perfectly mounted on the exposed brick wall. Imported rugs covered the floors, and a professional-grade espresso machine gleamed on the marble kitchen counter. It was exactly the kind of curated magazine-ready aesthetic Andre demanded to project his illusion of wealth. I walked right past all of it. I did not want the expensive espresso machine. I did not want the designer clothes he had purchased to make me look like a suitable trophy for his company holiday parties. I did not want a single piece of furniture in that apartment. I moved through the rooms with surgical precision, my mind operating on pure cold logic. I headed straight for the second bedroom. Andre called this room his executive office, though he mostly used it to drink expensive scotch and practice his golf putt on a synthetic grass mat. My designated workspace was a tiny, cramped desk shoved into the far corner, practically hidden behind his massive leather reclining chair. I knelt beneath my small desk and pulled out the heavy metal processing tower. I bypassed the standard startup protocols and entered a series of biometric passcodes to unlock the physical casing. Inside rested 3 encrypted military-grade solid-state drives. I carefully extracted them, the cool metal heavy in the palm of my hand. These 3 drives contained the absolute totality of my existence for the last 4 years. They contained Apex Ledger. While Andre was out at upscale bars buying rounds of drinks for men who secretly despised him, I was sitting in this dark corner writing thousands of lines of code. While he was maxing out credit cards to buy custom golf clubs, I was building a sophisticated financial technology algorithm capable of analyzing restructuring and automating household debt for millions of working-class families. Whenever Andre stumbled home late, smelling of premium cigars and cheap perfume, he would lean over my shoulder, look at the cascading green text on my monitors, and laugh. He loved calling it my silly budget blog. He would pat me on the head like a dog and tell me it was cute that I had a little hobby to keep me busy while he was out doing real business. He had absolutely no idea that my little hobby had just been valued at $2.5 million by a premier venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. I slid the 3 drives into a waterproof, shockproof carrying case and placed them securely into the bottom of my empty suitcase. That was it. That was the only asset in the entire apartment that held any actual value. Everything else in this house was a liability. I needed my birth certificate and my passport before heading to the airport. I walked over to Andre's massive oak desk and crouched down to open the bottom filing drawer. It was secured with a digital keypad. He used his own birthday for the combination, a testament to his staggering narcissism. I punched in the numbers and the drawer clicked open. I pushed past the neat folders labeled with his golf club memberships and vehicle lease agreements, reaching toward the back for the fireproof document bag. As I pulled the bag forward, my hand brushed against something wedged tightly against the back panel of the drawer. It was a thick, heavy manila envelope bulging at the seams and secured with wrapping tape. It looked entirely out of place among his perfectly organized files. Curiosity overrode my schedule. I pulled the heavy envelope out and broke the tape. I dumped the contents onto his pristine glass desktop. A mountain of paper cascaded across the surface. The very first document that caught my eye featured a massive bold red stamp across the top right corner. Past due. It was a final notice from his premier auto financing company. The luxury sport utility vehicle he had just used to abandon me in the dirt was 90 days delinquent. Repossession was scheduled for the end of the week. I sifted through the pile, my initial shock rapidly morphing into cold, calculated vindication. The next stack of papers consisted of personal loan documents. The numbers printed on the summary pages were staggering: 6 figures of high-interest, unsecured debt. I looked at the bottom of the contracts to see the signatures. The primary borrower on every single document was Julian, his older brother. The loans were for a series of phantom startup companies and doomed real estate flips that Julian had completely abandoned. Right below Julian's signature was Andre's name. My husband had secretly co-signed over $100,000 in high-risk loans, legally binding his own financial future to his brother's toxic incompetence. A specific vivid memory flashed in my mind. Just last month, Andre had cornered me in the kitchen while I was making dinner. His face was red with manufactured rage. He had slammed his fist down on the marble island, shattering a water glass, and screamed that my complete lack of ambition was draining our bank accounts. He blamed my refusal to take a generic entry-level corporate accounting job for the fact that we were struggling to make ends meet. He stood over me, his voice echoing off the tile, gaslighting me into believing that my silly computer hobby was the financial anchor dragging our marriage into the abyss. I stood in his office looking at the undeniable proof of his hypocrisy sitting in plain ink. He had blamed me for our financial ruin while secretly funding his brother's delusions and financing a fake lifestyle he could not even begin to afford. The absolute audacity of his projection extinguished whatever tiny, lingering flicker of sympathy I might have harbored for the man I married. There was no anger left in my body. There was only math, and Andre's calculations had finally run out. I reached over to my small desk and turned on my laser printer. The mechanical whir filled the quiet office. I opened my secure legal portal on my phone, accessed a document I had drafted weeks ago as a precaution, and sent it to the printer. I waited as the warm sheets of paper slid into the output tray. It was a formal, legally binding notice of divorce by abandonment, completely valid under state law, given the circumstances of his departure and my documented financial independence. I returned to his glass desk. I did not shove the debt notices back into the drawer. I wanted him to see his own ruin the absolute second he walked into the room. I arranged the past due notices in a neat symmetrical grid across the center of his workspace. I placed the repossession warning for his beloved luxury vehicle directly in the middle. I fanned the defaulted loan documents bearing his and Julian's signatures around it like a morbid frame. I picked up the warm divorce papers from the printer and slid them perfectly flush against the edge of his financial disasters. I looked down at my left hand. The diamond engagement ring and the matching wedding band glinted in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the office window. Looking at them now, I realized they were likely financed on a credit card he was currently hiding from collection agencies. I gripped the rings and pulled them off my finger. The metal felt surprisingly weightless. I placed the rings dead center on top of the repossession warning, a perfect heavy paperweight holding down the physical evidence of his shattered illusions. I walked back into the hallway and zipped the hard-shell suitcase closed. I pulled the extending handle up with a sharp click. I did not leave a sentimental note. I did not shed a single tear for the death of my marriage. I walked out the front door, leaving my apartment keys resting on the kitchen island. The heavy wooden door shut behind me, the automatic deadbolt engaging with a solid metallic thud, officially locking Andre into the nightmare he had built for himself. I walked out of the suffocating darkness of Andre's home office and moved purposefully into the pristine, aggressively modern kitchen. The marble island felt cold under my fingertips as I set my laptop down and opened the screen. The harsh glow of the monitor cut through the shadows of the silent apartment. For 4 excruciating years, I had allowed Andre to dictate the narrative of our financial lives. He had convinced his family, his friends, and tried desperately to convince me that he was the sole provider, the exhausted breadwinner carrying the dead weight of an unmotivated wife. He weaponized every dollar, using money as a tool to control my movements, my choices, and my confidence. I opened my encrypted financial portal, bypassing his weak security measures with practiced ease. I did not act out of malice or spite. I operated purely on undeniable math. I opened the master spreadsheet I had secretly maintained since the very first week of our marriage. Every single column was a testament to his financial reckless behavior and my silent stability. I pulled up the transaction histories for our joint checking and savings accounts. The screen displayed a chaotic mess of Andre's vanity purchases. Thousands of dollars bled out to premium steakhouses, luxury car detailing services, and expensive bar tabs used to impress colleagues who would forget his name the moment he left the room. There were charges for designer sunglasses he wore exactly once, and recurring payments for a country club membership he rarely used but constantly bragged about. Interspersed between his hemorrhaging expenditures were the steady, quiet deposits from my freelance accounting contracts and the initial seed dividends from my early algorithm testing. I tracked every grocery run I had funded, every utility bill I had covered, and every single time I had quietly transferred funds to cover the rent when his commission checks miraculously fell short. I was not going to take everything. I was not a thief. I was an accountant, and I demanded a perfectly balanced ledger. I totaled the exact amount of seed money I had contributed to the marriage over the past 48 months. The final number was precise down to the penny. It was $78,412.16. I initiated a high-priority wire transfer. I watched the cursor blink steadily as I pulled my exact contribution out of the joint accounts, funneling it directly into a secure single-signature offshore account established by my venture capital partners. I clicked confirm. I watched the progress bar turn bright green, finalizing the transaction. The joint savings account was instantly decimated. All that remained was Andre's meager balance, a pathetic sum of barely $2,000. That pathetic remainder would not even cover his upcoming luxury vehicle lease payment, let alone make a dent in the fraudulent business loans he had secretly co-signed for his brother Julian. I stared at the pathetic balance on the screen, feeling absolutely nothing for his impending ruin. He had built his own financial prison brick by expensive brick. I was simply walking out and locking the cell door behind me. I closed the laptop, the screen going black, and slipped it safely into my leather travel bag. With my financial assets legally extracted and my intellectual property safely packed, there was only one cord left to sever: the digital leash. Andre loved tracking my location through our shared cellular plan. He demanded I keep my phone glued to my hand, expecting immediate subservient replies to his text messages, while he routinely ignored my calls for hours. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the smartphone. The screen was cracked in the top right corner, a physical reminder of the time Chloe had thrown a tantrum at a family dinner, and Andre had slapped the phone out of my hand for checking a work email instead of paying attention to her manufactured drama. I held the device in the palm of my hand, feeling the weight of the invisible chains it represented. I navigated to the core system settings and initiated a total factory reset. A warning prompt flashed on the screen, demanding to know if I was absolutely certain I wanted to permanently erase all data, photos, messages, and accounts. I pressed confirm without a fraction of a second of hesitation. I watched the corporate logo dissolve into a blank loading bar. Years of digital gaslighting were wiped out of existence in real time. The thousands of passive-aggressive text messages from Beatrice demanding I cook for her church group, the manipulative group chats where Julian mocked my career choices, the fake smiling vacation photos where I was forced to stand in the back while Chloe took center stage. I watched the progress bar inch forward, systematically deleting the digital record of my subservience. All of it was digitally incinerated. The phone rebooted, displaying the generic bright white factory welcome screen. It was no longer a tracking device or a tool for their daily abuse. It was now just a useless, heavy piece of glass and plastic, wiped completely clean of Maya, the obedient wife. I walked back into Andre's office and placed the dead phone deliberately on top of the financial ruin waiting on his glass desk. I rested it right next to my discarded diamond wedding ring and the freshly printed divorce summons. I reached into my travel bag and retrieved a pristine, unblemished titanium smartphone. It was my new corporate device secured with enterprise-grade encryption, registered entirely under my maiden name, and operating on a private corporate network that could not be traced. I activated the screen. I updated my emergency contacts to my lead venture capital investor and my corporate attorney. I permanently blocked Andre, Julian, Chloe, Beatrice, and every single person associated with their toxic bloodline from my new digital footprint. They no longer had access to my location, my voice, or my peace of mind. I zipped my bag, grabbed the handle of my hard-shell suitcase, and walked out the front door. The heavy wooden door shut behind me, the automatic deadbolt engaging with a solid metallic thud, officially locking Andre into the nightmare he had built for himself. The morning sun was just beginning to burn through the coastal fog when I arrived at the international airport. The terminal was a symphony of rolling luggage, the low hum of thousands of conversations and quiet boarding announcements echoing from the overhead speakers. I bypassed the chaotic, winding lines of the main lobby and stepped smoothly into the expedited executive security lane. The air conditioning was crisp, smelling faintly of roasted coffee and aviation fuel, and the atmosphere was remarkably peaceful. I felt a strange, weightless sensation expanding in my chest, a physical lightness that came from shedding a massive, suffocating burden. I was no longer carrying the weight of Andre's insecurities or his family's relentless demands. Back at the empty, silent apartment in Atlanta, my dead phone was vibrating uselessly against the glass desk. My previous cellular carrier automatically forwarded the incoming text log to my secure email server as part of my account transition protocol. I opened the notification on my new titanium device while standing in the security line waiting for the agent to check my documents. The message was from Andre, sent just minutes ago from the comfort of the luxury mountain cabin. I read the words he had typed, his tone dripping with the same unearned authority he had used when he threw my bag into the dirt. Hope you learned your lesson out there in the dark. We are going to swing back to get you this morning before we hit the lake. Do not wander off. The sheer breathtaking arrogance of his words made me smile, a genuine bright smile right there in the airport terminal. He genuinely pictured me shivering in the dirt at that desolate rest stop all night, crying and waiting for his grand, merciful return. He thought he was teaching a disobedient wife a lesson in humility. He had absolutely no idea he was texting a ghost. I stepped forward, handing my boarding pass and my passport to the security agent. The destination printed in bold black ink on the ticket was San Francisco. I was not just leaving the state of Georgia. I was leaving the entire stratosphere of his miserable existence. I slipped my passport back into my bag and walked toward the departure gate, ready to build my empire. I moved through the TSA security checkpoint with the methodical efficiency of a woman who had just shed 200 pounds of dead weight. The agent handed back my passport, unaware that the name printed on the document was about to shake the financial technology sector. I slipped my shoes back on, grabbed my heavy travel bag, and walked purposefully toward the departure gates. The morning sunlight streamed through the massive glass windows, casting golden shadows across the polished concourse. I headed straight for the premium executive lounge, flashing my newly minted corporate black card to the attendant. The glass doors slid open, granting access to a quiet sanctuary smelling of espresso and expensive leather. I found a booth overlooking the bustling tarmac, sat down, and opened my laptop. It was time to sever the mental tether to my past and focus entirely on the empire waiting for me on the West Coast. I pulled up the finalized term sheets from Harrison & Vance, the premier venture capital firm, on Sand Hill Road. The numbers on the glowing screen were undeniable proof of my brilliance. Apex Ledger was no longer a quiet passion project. It was officially a fully funded, aggressive startup backed by a staggering $2.5 million seed round. I scrolled through the encrypted PDF, reading over the covenant's equity distributions and board seat allocations. I traced the digital signatures, transferring absolute executive control of the company directly to me. For 4 agonizing years, Andre had belittled my late nights at the keyboard. He aggressively mocked what he loved to call my silly budget blog. He genuinely believed I was designing digital grocery coupons for bored housewives while he played the high-powered corporate earner. He had treated my intellect like a pathetic hobby. The algorithm I had painstakingly designed was built to analyze, consolidate, and destroy the exact type of predatory consumer debt that Andre and his brother actively relied on to fund their fake luxury lifestyles. As the boarding announcement for my one-way flight to San Francisco echoed through the lounge, I closed my laptop and slid it into my bag. I walked down the jet bridge, the cool air hitting my face. Settling into my spacious first-class seat, I accepted a glass of sparkling water and leaned back. The jet engines roared to life, pushing me back into the seat as the plane accelerated down the runway. I watched the sprawling green canopy of the Georgia pine trees shrink into insignificant specks beneath the clouds. The ascent was smooth, silent, and permanent. I was no longer the quiet, obedient accountant making myself small to fit into Andre's suffocating world. I was the founder and chief executive officer of a company about to disrupt an entire industry. 3 days later, the brightly lit hallway of my former apartment building echoed with heavy footsteps and loud, miserable complaining. Andre swaggered down the carpeted corridor, his jaw clenched tight with intense irritation. He was heavily sunburned from a weekend drinking at the lake, his designer polo shirt wrinkled and smelling faintly of stale beer and campfire smoke. Julian walked closely behind him, dragging an oversized cooler that scraped loudly against the floorboards. Chloe trailed at the rear, scrolling aggressively on her phone and whining about the humidity ruining her expensive keratin hair treatment. They had spent Sunday morning driving an hour and a half back to the desolate rest stop, fully expecting to find me sitting in the dirt. Andre had spent the entire weekend loudly complaining to his family about how incredibly inconvenient my disappearance was. He had pictured me shivering on my cheap canvas duffel bag in the gravel, crying hysterically and ready to beg on my knees for his forgiveness. Instead, they had found the dirt lot completely empty. The realization that I was missing had forced them to drive around the county looking for me, effectively ruining Chloe's lavish Sunday brunch plans at the mountain resort. Andre swiped his electronic key fob against the apartment door lock. His face twisted into an ugly, cruel sneer. He pushed the heavy wooden door open and dropped his massive ring of keys onto the kitchen island with a loud clatter. He confidently anticipated finding me curled up on the white sectional sofa in the living room, panicked, exhausted, and ready to apologize. He was mentally preparing to deliver a blistering, condescending lecture about obedience, family loyalty, and his ultimate authority. He walked into the living room ready to shout my name and demand immediate submission, but the apartment was completely silent. The pristine white furniture sat empty. The kitchen was spotless. The air was perfectly still. Julian dropped the heavy cooler onto the imported rug with a loud thud, wiping sweat from his forehead and complaining about his back. Chloe walked past them immediately, complaining that the air conditioning was set too high and declaring that my toxic, negative energy was probably still ruining the atmosphere of the apartment. Andre frowned, a flicker of genuine confusion breaking through his arrogant exterior. He marched down the hallway, throwing open the master bedroom door. The bed was perfectly made, the pillows fluffed. He turned on his heel and marched back down the hall toward his executive office, completely determined to find me cowering at my tiny desk in the corner, hiding from his wrath. Andre shoved the heavy office door open. My small desk in the corner was completely bare. The monitors and processing tower were gone. Every trace of my silly budget blog had been surgically extracted. Andre froze in the doorway, his wide eyes darting from my empty corner to his massive oak desk. He took 3 slow steps forward, his breath catching in his throat as he realized what rested on the glass surface. In the exact center sat his final repossession warning for his beloved luxury sport utility vehicle. Surrounding it like a morbid halo were the defaulted personal loan documents bearing his and Julian's signatures. Resting directly on top of the repossession notice was my diamond engagement ring and matching wedding band. Right next to the rings was a crisp, freshly printed legal document. Andre picked it up with shaking hands. The bold black letters across the top read, "Notice of divorce by abandonment." He dropped the paper as if it had physically burned him. Panic finally pierced his fragile ego. He lunged for his leather desk chair, threw it back, and ripped open his laptop. His fingers fumbled across the keyboard as he navigated to our joint banking portal. He typed in his password, his heart hammering against his ribs. The dashboard loaded, displaying his available balance, $2,114. He refreshed the page, assuming it was a banking glitch. The number remained exactly the same. He clicked into the transaction history and saw the massive outbound wire transfer. I had extracted exactly $78,412.16. Every single penny of the seed money I had contributed to our accounts over the last 4 years was gone. I had not touched a dime of his own money, but his money was nothing but an illusion built on staggering debt. His entire financial safety net had vanished in a single keystroke. Julian walked into the office holding a beer, stopping short when he saw his brother pale and hyperventilating. Chloe squeezed into the room behind him, her voice a sharp whine. She demanded Andre transfer the deposit for her upcoming luxury wellness retreat in Sedona. She insisted her aura needed cleansing after dealing with my toxic behavior all weekend. Andre slowly turned his head to look at his brother's wife. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. The realization washed over Chloe's face as she looked at the bank screen, then down at the mountain of unpaid debt notices scattered across the desk. The luxury retreat was gone. The fake wealth was gone. Chloe let out a shrill scream, collapsing into loud tears as the reality of their financial ruin shattered her delusions. Julian stepped back, his face draining of color as he recognized his signatures on the desk. Andre stood up, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. His entire world was burning down around him, the flames sparked by the quiet, obedient wife he had discarded in the dirt. But his absolute arrogance was a terminal disease. He completely refused to accept defeat. He stared at my abandoned wedding rings, his jaw set in stubborn, blinding denial. "She will come crawling right back when she runs out of money," Andre declared, his voice echoing in the empty room. He was completely and entirely unaware that 2,000 miles away, I was already walking confidently into my new corner office, a fully funded, untouchable billionaire in the making. 3 years is a remarkably short amount of time for an entire lineage to completely devour itself, but toxic systems accelerate their own collapse once the host body detaches. Without my quiet, steady financial infusions acting as a tourniquet, Andre's fragile reality bled out rapidly. The descent was not a spectacular explosion. It was a slow, humiliating rot that infected every corner of his daily existence. Julian and Chloe were the first to drown. Chloe possessed a dangerous combination of unearned entitlement and zero financial literacy. She continued booking luxury wellness retreats in Sedona and charging designer handbags to credit cards with 30% interest rates. Julian, desperate to maintain the illusion of being a dominant patriarch, hid the collection notices until the repo men physically towed Chloe's least luxury sport utility vehicle out of a premium grocery store parking lot. The public humiliation shattered their carefully curated social facade. Julian's phantom real estate flips finally collapsed under the weight of market shifts and his own profound incompetence. Facing total bankruptcy and eviction, Julian and Chloe did exactly what parasites do when their primary host dies. They found a new one. They packed their remaining designer clothes into garbage bags and moved into the cramped spare bedroom of Andre's newly rented, decidedly downscale apartment in the suburbs. The dynamic inside that small apartment was a pressure cooker of resentment. Julian, utterly emasculated by his financial ruin, spent his days drinking Andre's cheap beer and criticizing his younger brother's career trajectory. Chloe complained incessantly about the lack of central air conditioning and the cheap laminate flooring, treating Andre like a disappointing hotel concierge. Because Andre was fundamentally incapable of establishing boundaries with his older brother, he simply absorbed the abuse, silently subsidizing their existence, while his own debt multiplied like a virus. Beatrice suffered perhaps the most agonizing fall from grace. For decades, her entire identity within her wealthy Atlanta church congregation was predicated on the overwhelming success of her two brilliant sons. She had reigned over the Sunday fellowship hours, draped in expensive hats, loudly bragging about Julian's real estate empire and Andre's corporate dominance. When Julian filed for bankruptcy, the church gossips feasted. When Andre was forced to downgrade his lifestyle to keep his brother afloat, the whispers grew deafening. Beatrice could no longer volunteer to fund the church floral arrangements or host the lavish holiday banquets. Her social currency evaporated overnight. Stripped of her ability to flaunt her son's fabricated wealth, Beatrice became just another bitter woman, sitting in the back pew, watching her peers whisper behind their programs. Instead of holding his family accountable or examining his own catastrophic failures, Andre retreated into a fortress of absolute delusion. He became the perpetual victim of a cruel, unfeeling universe, and I was the primary villain in his fabricated narrative. He spent his lunch breaks at his mid-level tech sales firm, cornering younger, inexperienced colleagues in the break room to tell his tragic story. He painted a picture of a loyal, hardworking husband who had been ruthlessly discarded by a crazy, ungrateful wife. He told anyone who would listen that my sudden departure had triggered his temporary financial setbacks, conveniently omitting the fact that I had only taken the exact seed money I had personally earned. He claimed I was unstable, overly emotional, and completely incapable of handling the pressures of an executive lifestyle. Beatrice eagerly amplified this fiction. During her frantic daily phone calls to Andre, she would loudly curse my name, declaring that my toxic energy had poisoned the family's luck. She told Andre that I had abandoned my vows because I was too selfish to support him through a temporary rough patch. Andre absorbed her validation like a sponge. It shielded him from the terrifying reality that his ruin was entirely self-inflicted. His arrogance was most evident in how he handled the divorce proceedings. When the process server handed him the notice of divorce by abandonment at his office, Andre had literally laughed in the man's face. He tossed the thick manila envelope onto his messy desk and left it there to gather dust. He genuinely believed that ignoring the paperwork was a display of ultimate power. He told Julian that he was intentionally making me sweat, forcing me to wait in legal limbo until he decided I had suffered enough. He thought my silence over the past 3 years was proof that I was struggling too ashamed to admit my mistake. He expected that one day my pride would break and I would call him crying, begging to be allowed back into his life. He was entirely ignorant of how the legal system actually functioned. By refusing to respond to the summons contest, the timeline, or appear at the scheduled hearings, he handed my corporate attorneys a flawless victory. The judge granted a default judgment of divorce cleanly and permanently, severing all legal and financial ties between us. I was completely free, legally insulated from his mounting debts, and he had willingly handed me the key because his ego demanded he play a game of chicken that I had already won. By the end of the 3rd year, Andre was clinging to the very edge of an abyss. His sales figures at the struggling technology firm were abysmal. He spent more time managing his collection calls than prospecting new clients. His credit score was a smoking crater, making it impossible for him to secure a new apartment lease or refinance his crushing personal loans. Julian and Chloe were bleeding him dry, eating his food, running up his electricity bill, and offering absolutely nothing in return. Beatrice was constantly asking him for money to keep up her church donations, entirely blind to the fact that her son was skipping meals to make minimum credit card payments. Andre's only remaining lifeline was his job, and that lifeline was currently fraying at a rapid pace. The mid-level sales firm he worked for was a dinosaur clinging to outdated software models and hemorrhaging enterprise clients to faster, sleeker startups. The office environment was a graveyard of low morale and whispered rumors of imminent layoffs. Andre sat at his cubicle desk on a rainy Tuesday morning, his head pounding with a stress migraine. He was staring at a spreadsheet showing his quarterly sales deficit, when his inbox chimed with an urgent company-wide meeting invitation. Attendance was strictly mandatory. 10 minutes later, Andre crowded into the stuffy main conference room along with 50 other anxious employees. The regional vice president, a sweaty, nervous man who had been visibly panicking for weeks, stood at the front of the room. He did not waste time with pleasantries. He bluntly announced that the firm was operating in the red. They had missed their revenue targets for 4 consecutive quarters. Bankruptcy was not just a possibility, it was a mathematical certainty scheduled for the end of the fiscal year. A collective groan rippled through the room. Andre felt his stomach drop into his shoes. If he lost this salary, he would be on the street within 30 days. Julian, Chloe, and his mother would drown right alongside him. But the vice president raised his hands, signaling for quiet. He wiped his forehead and delivered the caveat. There was one singular hope for survival. A massive, aggressive Silicon Valley financial technology titan was looking to aggressively expand its East Coast footprint. This titan was not interested in their outdated software, but they desperately needed their established regional client list and their physical infrastructure. They were offering a comprehensive acquisition buyout. The vice president outlined the terms with desperate enthusiasm. If the acquisition went through, the Silicon Valley giant would absorb the entire sales team. They would inject millions into the regional office, upgrade the commission structures, and provide massive retention bonuses to keep the current staff locked in during the transition. Andre felt a sudden, massive surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was the miracle he had been waiting for. A retention bonus from a multi-billion-dollar tech giant would instantly wipe out his suffocating debt. It would allow him to finally kick Julian and Chloe out of his apartment. It would restore his mother's pride. It would put him right back on top where he belonged. He could already picture himself driving a brand new luxury vehicle into the church parking lot, silencing all the gossips who had doubted him. "Who is the buyer?" Someone from the back of the room called out, voicing the question hovering in everyone's mind. The vice president smiled, a genuine expression of relief washing over his face. He clicked a button on his presentation remote. The projector screen behind him illuminated with a stark, aggressively modern logo. It was a sleek, minimalist geometric design in sharp silver and deep obsidian. "The company is called Apex Ledger," the vice president announced, his voice echoing in the silent room. "They are the fastest-growing fintech platform in the world right now. Their founder and chief executive officer is flying in from San Francisco next week to personally audit our sales floor and finalize the acquisition. I expect every single one of you to be on your absolute best behavior. Our entire future depends on impressing her." Andre stared at the glowing silver logo on the screen. The name sounded vaguely familiar, triggering a faint, hazy memory of a late-night argument in a luxury apartment he no longer lived in. But his arrogance completely blocked the connection. He leaned back in his cheap office chair, crossing his arms over his chest with a smug, self-satisfied smile. He was a master at impressing corporate executives. He was charming, he was handsome, and he knew exactly how to play the corporate game. He mentally calculated how he would approach the new CEO, how he would secure his position as her top regional manager, and how he would ride her company's wealth straight to the top. He had absolutely no idea that the executioner coming to audit his life was the exact same woman he had abandoned in the Georgia dirt. The air in the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor of the Apex Ledger Tower was perfectly climate-controlled and smelled of expensive espresso. I stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the sprawling, fog-draped expanse of the San Francisco Bay. 3 years had passed since I walked out of that apartment in Atlanta with a single suitcase and a titanium smartphone. In those 36 months, I had meticulously built an empire from the ground up, operating exclusively under my maiden name, Maya Sterling. The venture capital seed round of $2.5 million had been the spark. The algorithm I had coded in the dark, the one Andre had endlessly mocked as a silly budget blog, had become a raging wildfire in the financial technology sector. We did not just consolidate debt. We aggressively analyzed, dismantled, and destroyed the predatory lending models that kept the middle class trapped in perpetual financial servitude. Apex Ledger empowered millions of users, shifting the balance of power away from massive credit institutions and placing it directly into the hands of consumers. I had stripped away the obedient, subservient persona I once wore to keep the peace in my marriage. I was now a self-made titan, operating with a ruthless surgical precision that terrified my competitors and thrilled my board of directors. I was completely untouchable. My days were no longer dictated by the fragile egos of insecure men or the demands of a toxic family structure. Instead, my schedule was ruled by global market openings, quarterly earnings calls, and aggressive expansion strategies. I wore tailored suits that functioned like armor, projecting absolute authority the moment I walked into a room. The financial press routinely requested interviews, eager to profile the visionary woman who was systematically dismantling the credit industry. I declined them all. I preferred to operate in the shadows, letting the success of my platform speak for itself. My anonymity was my greatest asset. It allowed me to move through the corporate world without the distraction of celebrity, focused on dominating the market. The industry only knew the name Maya Sterling, a brilliant founder who had seemingly materialized out of thin air to disrupt the status quo. They knew absolutely nothing about the terrified accountant who had once been forced to hide her intellect. That woman was dead incinerated by the choices I had made the morning I wiped my phone clean and boarded a flight to the West Coast. In her place stood a woman who controlled billions of dollars in asset management. The mahogany doors to my boardroom swung open with a quiet, heavy thud. Marcus, my director of acquisitions, strode into the room carrying a thick portfolio. Marcus was a shark in a tailored suit, a man I had personally poached from a rival firm because he possessed the exact predatory instincts I required for our aggressive expansion campaign. Apex Ledger was currently in the middle of a massive buyout phase. We were absorbing smaller, struggling companies not for their outdated software, but for their established regional infrastructure and their extensive client contact lists. It was a strategy of ruthless assimilation. We bought the dying companies for pennies on the dollar, gutted their useless platforms, integrated their client bases into the Apex Ledger ecosystem, and discarded the executive deadweight. It was efficient, brutal, and highly profitable. Marcus dropped the heavy leather portfolio onto the center of the massive glass conference table. He looked up at me, a sharp, satisfied smile playing across his lips. "We found the perfect target for the East Coast expansion phase," Marcus announced, taking a seat at the table and gesturing toward the closed portfolio. It is a mid-level enterprise sales firm based out of Atlanta. They are operating on an archaic legacy software system that is completely bleeding clients. Their revenue numbers are in free fall, and they have missed their corporate projections for 4 consecutive quarters. They are drowning in operational debt, and their parent company is actively looking to liquidate the entire regional division before bankruptcy forces their hand. But they have exactly what we need. Their regional data centers are fully operational, and their client list is an absolute goldmine. If we acquire them now, we can buy the entire operation for a fraction of its market value. We gut their management team, migrate their clients to our platform, and establish an immediate dominant footprint on the East Coast. It is a textbook hostile takeover, Maya. They are desperate, completely out of options, and ready to sign anything we put in front of them to avoid total financial ruin. I walked slowly away from the window and took my seat at the head of the long glass table. The smooth surface felt grounding beneath my fingertips. I reached out and pulled the heavy leather portfolio toward me. I flipped it open, scanning the executive summary on the first page. The numbers Marcus had compiled were indeed pathetic. The target firm was a bloated, inefficient dinosaur, suffering from gross mismanagement and a complete lack of visionary leadership. It was the kind of rotting corporate carcass that Apex Ledger specialized in devouring. I turned the page to review the operational structure and the personnel files. Marcus had included detailed dossiers on the current executive team and the regional sales managers. These were the men who were desperately praying for an acquisition buyout to save their careers. I scanned the first few pages of glossy corporate headshots, and inflated resumes, my eyes scanning the text with practiced clinical detachment. Then, I turned to the fourth page of the personnel dossier, and my entire body went perfectly unnaturally still. Staring back at me from the glossy page was a photograph of Andre. He was wearing the exact same smug expression he had worn on the day we were married. The text below his photograph listed him as the lead regional sales manager for the struggling firm. The universe has a remarkable poetic sense of irony. Out of the thousands of failing technology companies scattered across the country, my director of acquisitions had inadvertently selected the exact firm where my ex-husband was begging for his survival. I read his corporate biography. It was a masterpiece of fabricated accomplishments and empty corporate jargon, perfectly mirroring the man himself. He claimed responsibility for regional growth that the financial documents proved was non-existent. He listed leadership awards from years ago, desperately trying to mask his current failures. I stared at the name printed in bold black ink. Andre, the man who had thrown my bag into the dirt, who had spent years treating my intellect as a joke, and who had confidently declared that I would come crawling back to him when I ran out of money. A predatory smile spread across my face. I did not feel a single ounce of fear or anxiety. The terrified, subservient wife who used to shrink away from his loud voice was entirely gone. In her place was a woman holding the power to annihilate his entire existence with a single signature. Marcus watched me closely from across the table, noticing the shift in my demeanor. "Is there a problem with the target profile?" he asked, his tone shifting into professional concern. I shook my head, my eyes locked on the image of the man who thought he had broken me. "There is no problem at all, Marcus. In fact, this profile is absolutely flawless." I closed the heavy leather portfolio with a sharp, decisive snap. I looked up at my director of acquisitions, my smile widening into something dangerous. "We are going to proceed with the acquisition immediately. But I do not want to negotiate this buyout over email or remote video conferences. We are going to do this the right way." I stood up from the glass table, my voice carrying the absolute authority of a powerful billionaire founder. "I want you to draft the preliminary acquisition documents and non-disclosure agreements today. Then I want you to personally contact the regional vice president of that failing firm. You are going to extend a formal mandatory invitation to their entire executive staff, including all of their lead regional sales managers. They are to be flown out here to San Francisco next week. They will attend our annual corporate acquisition gala at the Grand Ballroom downtown. Tell them the founder of Apex Ledger wishes to meet them face to face before finalizing the ultimate buyout. Tell them their professional future depends entirely on this meeting." Marcus nodded enthusiastically, completely unaware of the trap he was helping me construct. He gathered the leather portfolio and walked out of the room to execute my specific orders. I turned back to the massive window, looking out over the sparkling bay. Andre was finally coming to Silicon Valley, and I was going to serve him his absolute undeniable destruction on a beautiful silver platter. Back in Atlanta, the news of the mandatory San Francisco gala landed in Andre's inbox like a winning lottery ticket. His regional vice president had forwarded the invitation with a desperate note, emphasizing the absolute necessity of making a flawless impression. Andre did not just read the email, he absorbed it as divine validation of his own inherent greatness. He convinced himself the founder of Apex Ledger specifically wanted to meet him. In his distorted, fragile reality, his mediocre sales figures were actually a testament to his unrecognized genius, and this Silicon Valley titan was finally the visionary who would appreciate his talents. He strutted through his failing office, treating his panicked coworkers with insufferable pity. He was already spending the massive retention bonus in his empty head. But a simple business trip was not enough to satisfy his ravenous ego. He needed an audience. He needed a parade. He went home to his cramped suburban rental and gathered his desperate parasitic family in the living room to make his grand announcement. He stood before Julian, Chloe, and Beatrice, adopting the posture of a conquering hero. He declared that his firm was being acquired by a multi-billion-dollar tech behemoth and that he was personally flying to California to finalize the executive transition. He promised them this deal would instantly make him a millionaire. He spun a ridiculous fantasy where he would be named the senior vice president of East Coast operations, commanding a seven-figure salary and limitless stock options. The financial ruin that had been suffocating them for 3 years was officially over. But his arrogance required witnesses. He told them they were all coming with him. Beatrice clapped her hands, tears of joy streaming down her face as she praised her golden son. Chloe began listing the luxury boutiques she intended to raid in Union Square. Julian clapped his brother on the back, his bruised masculinity temporarily soothed by the prospect of riding Andre's coattails back to wealth. They were completely oblivious to the fact that Andre did not have a single dollar to his name. To fund this extravagant West Coast victory lap, Andre resorted to the only financial strategy he actually understood. He willingly committed total financial suicide. He applied for 3 high-risk predatory credit cards, leveraging the last fragile remnants of his credit score. When the approvals came through carrying catastrophic 30% interest rates, he immediately maxed them out. He booked 4 premium airline tickets, reserved 2 luxury suites at a 5-star hotel in downtown San Francisco, and scheduled high-end dinner reservations to celebrate his impending wealth. He was building an aggressive, fragile house of cards, blissfully unaware that a hurricane was waiting for him at the destination. He packed his cheap, heavily branded luggage with absolute certainty that this trip would erase every single mistake he had ever made. He genuinely believed that the universe was finally handing him the crown he deserved. The morning of the flight, the family moved through the Atlanta airport with the obnoxious, unearned swagger of royalty. Beatrice wore a large, ostentatious hat, loudly complaining about the slow service in the security line, while making sure everyone around her knew her son was flying them out for a massive corporate buyout. Chloe marched ahead wearing oversized designer sunglasses indoors, dragging a suitcase she fully intended to fill with other people's money. Julian trailed behind, already buzzing on overpriced airport cocktails, loudly bragging about his brother's immense negotiating power. Andre led the pack, his chest puffed out wearing a new tailored suit he could not afford. They boarded the aircraft and settled into their seats, a physical manifestation of terminal delusion. For the first 4 hours of the cross-country flight, they toasted their own fabricated success. They drank premium champagne on a credit card that would inevitably default before the end of the month. Andre reclined his seat, a smug, self-satisfied smile plastered across his face. He felt completely untouchable. He was the breadwinner, the patriarch, the ultimate savior of his bloodline. He was about to secure his legacy. As the aircraft began its initial descent over the Sierra Nevada mountains, the seatbelt sign chimed, breaking the quiet hum of the cabin. Andre reached into his leather messenger bag and pulled out his company-issued tablet. He connected to the onboard wireless network, intending to review his sales pitches one final time. His inbox refreshed, displaying a high-priority message from his regional vice president. The subject line read, "Apex Ledger Founder Dossier, Strictly Confidential." The body of the email contained a single sentence instructing the management team to familiarize themselves with the CEO's background before the gala. Andre clicked the attached PDF file with supreme, absolute confidence. He fully anticipated reading about an older, aggressive venture capitalist, perhaps some Stanford-educated tech bro with a penchant for ruthless acquisitions. He was ready to find the psychological angle he could exploit to secure his massive retention bonus. He watched the progress bar inch across the screen as the heavy PDF document downloaded. The file opened, displaying a pristine high-resolution scan of a recent Forbes magazine cover. Andre stared at the glowing screen. The ambient noise of the airplane cabin vanished. His breathing stopped. The blood instantly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray. He blinked hard, assuming the cabin altitude was causing a violent hallucination. He rubbed his eyes and stared at the screen, but the image did not change. Staring back at him from the digital cover, wearing a sharp, impeccably tailored obsidian suit and a predatory, unyielding smile, was his completely discarded, supposedly broken ex-wife. The bold, bright white text beneath my photograph read, "Maya Sterling, the silent titan, dismantling the credit industry." Below that, a smaller caption highlighted Apex Ledger's staggering $3 billion market valuation. There was no mistake. There was no alternate explanation. The visionary founder, the ruthless executive coming to audit his miserable life, the singular person holding absolute power over his career, his family, and his total financial survival was me. Andre's hands began to shake with such violent intensity that he nearly dropped the expensive tablet onto the floor. His perfect, arrogant delusion completely shattered in a fraction of a second. The reality of his situation crashed down on him with the force of a falling anvil. He had spent 3 years telling everyone I was a crazy, unstable failure who was begging for his attention. He had ignored the divorce summons to teach me a lesson. He had dragged his entire parasitic family across the country on predatory credit cards to celebrate a buyout that was actually a meticulously planned execution. He had walked willingly, proudly straight into an absolute slaughterhouse. Blind panic, thick and suffocating, violently seized his tight throat. He could not breathe. He frantically exited the document, his fingers fumbling in sheer terror. He opened his contacts list, scrolling with desperate, frantic speed until he found my old, disconnected number. He prayed to any god that would listen that I had kept the same digits. 2,000 miles away, inside the secure, soundproof walls of my corner office at Apex Ledger, my sleek, encrypted executive smartphone rested silently on my polished desk. I was currently reviewing the final catering arrangements for the acquisition gala when the screen suddenly illuminated. I set my pen down and watched the digital display. A notification flashed. One missed call from an unrecognized Georgia area code. Then another followed by another. Then a rapid, frantic succession of alerts. Within exactly 60 seconds of his flight entering California airspace, the screen became a chaotic cascade of sheer panic. 10 missed calls, 25 missed calls, 41 missed calls. They were immediately followed by a desperate, pathetic flood of text messages. The previews flashed across the locked screen, each one more frantic than the last. "Maya, please pick up. Maya, we need to talk. Maya, please tell me this is a joke. Maya, please, I am begging you." I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, crossing my arms over my chest. I watched the frantic digital display with absolute chilling calm. The pathetic desperation radiating from those incoming messages was the exact sound of a man watching his entire universe burn to ash. He was finally experiencing the absolute suffocating terror of complete powerlessness. For years, he had used his phone as a weapon of control, demanding my immediate compliance while ignoring my existence. Now the dynamic was permanently inverted. He was trapped in a metal tube thousands of feet in the air, flying straight toward the woman he had abused, completely aware that I held the power to eradicate him. I did not reach for the device. I did not silence the notifications. I simply watched the screen glow, offering him the exact same cold, empty silence he had once offered me. I did not answer a single one. The grand ballroom at the zenith of the Transamerica Pyramid was a masterclass in modern corporate intimidation and architectural dominance. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the San Francisco skyline, the dense rolling fog creeping over the glowing cables of the Golden Gate Bridge like a slow, deliberate tide. Inside the expansive room, the atmosphere hummed with the quiet, dangerous energy of apex predators operating at the absolute peak of their power. Waiters in immaculate white jackets circulated with silver trays of vintage champagne and beluga caviar, moving silently over imported Italian marble floors. The room was packed with the absolute elite of Silicon Valley. Aggressive venture capitalists, heavy-hitting angel investors, and the ruthlessly efficient board of directors for Apex Ledger stood in tight, hushed clusters, casually discussing global market manipulation and nine-figure technological acquisitions. I stood near the very center of the opulent room, holding a crystal flute of sparkling water, quietly surveying my kingdom. I was not wearing a traditional ball gown. I wore a sharply tailored obsidian Alexander McQueen power suit that fit like a second layer of armor, completely stripped of any soft accommodating femininity. My dark hair was pulled back into a severe, sleek twist. I was the singular architect of this financial empire, and my physical presence commanded immediate, absolute deference from every billionaire in the room. Marcus, my director of acquisitions, stood at my right shoulder, reviewing the final guest manifest on his encrypted tablet. He was practically vibrating with aggressive corporate excitement, completely unaware of the deeply personal surgical execution he had helped me orchestrate. He genuinely thought we were simply here to absorb a dying East Coast sales firm and harvest their regional client list for our expansion. He had absolutely no idea that the men walking into this room tonight were the very monsters who had spent 4 agonizing years trying to bury me alive. I took a slow, deliberate sip of my iced water, feeling a profound, chilling sense of calm radiating through my chest. The frantic, desperate barrage of text messages and voicemails Andre had sent me all week had gone completely unanswered. I had let him marinate in his own suffocating, blinding terror, allowing his mind to completely devour itself as he flew across the country toward his own slaughter. Now the trap was officially set. The heavy steel jaws were pulled back, waiting for the rat to step onto the trigger. The heavy brass doors at the entrance of the grand ballroom swung open, and the atmosphere in the room seemed to momentarily shift. I turned my gaze toward the grand foyer, watching as the final stragglers from the acquired Atlanta firm stumbled blindly into the lion's den. It was a pathetic, almost comical visual display of ruin. Andre, Julian, Chloe, and Beatrice stepped onto the imported marble, looking like a group of desperate, confused imposters who had accidentally wandered onto a high-budget movie set. The stark, undeniable contrast between the genuine, effortless wealth of my board members and the cheap, fabricated luxury of my former family was staggering. Andre was sweating profusely under the harsh chandelier lights. His breathing was visibly shallow and rapid. He was wearing a rented black tuxedo that was slightly too tight across the shoulders, the cheap synthetic fabric completely failing to mask the sheer, blinding panic radiating from his pores. He looked around the opulent, sprawling room with wide, terrified eyes, realizing instantly that he had absolutely zero power or influence in this stratosphere. Julian stood slightly behind him, looking completely out of his depth. The older brother, who had constantly mocked my career choices, was now staring at the vaulted ceiling, with his mouth hanging open, his cheap drugstore cologne completely overpowered by the scent of expensive imported floral arrangements. Chloe, usually so aggressively confident in her superficial suburban vanity, looked small, frightened, and severely inadequate. She was wearing a brightly colored, heavily sequined dress that might have impressed the local gossips at a cheap country club, but looked outrageously tacky among the sleek, minimalist designer wear of the Silicon Valley elite. She kept tugging nervously at the hem of her skirt, eyeing the billionaire tech investors as if they were hostile alien life forms. And Beatrice, the grand matriarch who had spent years treating me like a subservient, uneducated maid, looked physically ill. She clutched a knockoff designer handbag tightly to her chest, like a protective shield, her posture hunched, defensive, and thoroughly defeated. Her usual arrogant swagger was completely gone, replaced by the terrifying realization that her golden sons were nothing more than insignificant specks of dust in this massive room. They were a collective monument to financial delusion, standing directly at the edge of the abyss, completely paralyzed by the overwhelming altitude. I watched them huddle together near the entrance, a tight, trembling knot of absolute desperation. Marcus noticed my fixed, unblinking gaze and leaned in closely. "That is the regional management team from Atlanta," he whispered, a tone of deep professional disgust coloring his voice. "They look completely terrified." I highly doubt they have ever seen this kind of liquid capital in their entire lives. Do you want me to have the security team intercept them before they embarrass themselves in front of the primary investors? I raised my hand, a silent, absolute command for him to stand down. No, Marcus, I replied, my voice smooth, cold, and perfectly detached. Let them walk the floor. I want them to feel the full crushing weight of this room. Andre began to frantically scan the crowd. I could see the desperate, wild calculation turning in his eyes. He was looking for the exit, looking for a way to salvage his rapidly crumbling ego, but mostly, he was looking for me. He pushed past a waiter, nearly knocking a heavy silver tray of champagne glasses to the floor, his head swiveling wildly in every direction. The terror of the digital Forbes magazine cover was clearly playing on a continuous, inescapable loop in his mind. He desperately needed to find the quiet, obedient, subservient wife he had mercilessly bullied for 4 years. He needed to prove to himself that the powerful, untouchable chief executive officer on the screen was just a cruel illusion. And then through the shifting crowd of wealthy executives, our eyes locked across the vast expanse of the crowded ballroom. The physical reaction was absolutely instantaneous. I saw the breath forcefully leave his lungs. I saw the last remaining fragment of his arrogant delusion shatter into a million jagged pieces. He stared at me, taking in the expensive obsidian suit, the posture of absolute corporate command, and the tight ring of powerful executives waiting on my every single word. For a fraction of a second, I thought he might actually collapse. I genuinely thought the sheer crushing reality of his total defeat would send him crashing to the polished marble floor. But Andre was a creature built entirely on toxic terminal narcissism. He possessed a terrifying, almost clinical inability to accept his own irrelevance. Instead of retreating, instead of hanging his head and walking out the heavy brass doors with whatever tiny shred of dignity he had left, his mind snapped into a grotesque survival mechanism. He puffed out his chest aggressively, adjusted the lapels of his rented tuxedo, and grabbed his mother tightly by the arm. He motioned frantically for Julian and Chloe to follow him. He did not walk cautiously. He did not approach with the professional deference required when meeting the chief executive officer of a multi-billion-dollar acquiring firm. He lowered his head and practically sprinted across the ballroom floor. He shoved aggressively past 2 prominent angel investors and a senior vice president, rudely ignoring their annoyed glares, dragging his pathetic, trembling family directly into the center of my exclusive executive circle. Marcus immediately stepped forward, his body language shifting into a defensive, highly protective stance, raising his hand to signal the armed security team stationed at the perimeter of the room. I placed a single calm hand on Marcus's forearm, stopping him instantly. I wanted this. I had painstakingly orchestrated every single second of this exact moment. I stood perfectly still, my spine completely rigid, my expression a mask of cold, impenetrable titanium. Andre halted less than 3 feet away from me. He was breathing heavily, a fine sheen of nervous sweat coating his forehead. Beatrice stood trembling directly behind him, her eyes wide with a sickening mixture of horror and profound confusion as she finally recognized the woman she had repeatedly treated like garbage. Julian and Chloe practically cowered in their shadows, absolutely terrified of the power dynamic shifting in the room. The ambient conversation in our immediate circle died instantly, the silence growing incredibly heavy and drawing the curious, judgmental stares of the surrounding board members. Andre looked at the powerful, incredibly wealthy executives flanking my sides. He looked at the vast, glittering corporate empire I had built entirely without him. The absolute reality of his utter destruction was staring him directly in the face, yet his massive ego demanded one final spectacular display of sheer delusion. He completely refused to acknowledge the power dynamic. He refused to address me as his superior or his boss. Instead, he forced a sickening, entirely fabricated smile onto his sweating face. He stepped aggressively into my personal space, completely ignoring the sharp gasps of my security detail closing in from behind. He aggressively reached out, attempting to wrap his arms around my shoulders in a dominant, overly familiar embrace, trying desperately to play the role of the charismatic, forgiving husband in front of my entire corporate staff. He leaned his head down, his mouth hovering just inches from my ear, his breath smelling sour and metallic with raw, undeniable fear. He completely ignored the powerful executives watching him with utter revulsion. He squeezed my shoulder, his fingers digging into the expensive fabric of my suit, and loudly whispered his desperate, pathetic demand. "Maya, baby, we need to talk privately. Let's fix this." I looked down at the hand resting on my shoulder, feeling a profound wave of absolute revulsion wash over my entire body. The sheer audacity of his touch, the arrogant assumption that he could simply whisper a sweet nothing and erase years of systematic psychological abuse, was breathtaking. I did not flinch. I did not pull away with sudden panicked movements. Instead, I slowly and deliberately turned my head to stare directly at his fingers, my expression so entirely devoid of warmth that he instinctively pulled his hand back as if he had been burned. The fake, charming smile he had plastered across his sweating face began to violently tremble at the corners. He was waiting for my compliance, waiting for the obedient wife to shrink under his dominant posture. He was going to wait for the rest of his miserable life. I stepped back, creating a cold, undeniable physical boundary between us. The surrounding executives, sensing the sudden, sharp drop in the emotional temperature of the room, naturally parted, creating a wide circle of polished marble around us. I gestured smoothly toward the elevated glass-walled VIP lounge situated at the far end of the grand ballroom. The lounge was an architectural masterpiece of corporate intimidation. It was completely soundproofed from the inside, ensuring absolute privacy for high-level negotiations. But its walls were constructed of perfectly clear floor-to-ceiling structural glass. Anyone standing inside was completely visible to the hundreds of powerful industry leaders populating the main floor. It was a beautiful, inescapable display case. If you require a private conversation regarding the operational future of your failing division, we can step into the executive lounge, I said, my voice carrying the crisp, impersonal authority of a billionaire founder addressing a low-level employee. Andre swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against the tight collar of his rented tuxedo. He nodded eagerly, completely missing the trap. He genuinely believed he had secured an opening. He grabbed his mother by the elbow, signaling Julian and Chloe to follow, and practically marched toward the glass enclosure. I walked slowly behind them, flanked by Marcus and two members of my private security detail. As we crossed the ballroom floor, I could feel the intense, curious gaze of every venture capitalist and board member tracking our movement. They knew Apex Ledger was executing a hostile takeover, and they were watching the corporate slaughter unfold in real time. We entered the VIP lounge, and the heavy glass door sealed shut behind us with a solid, airtight click, instantly muting the ambient hum of the gala outside. The room was sleek and intimidating, featuring a massive digital display table and a central microphone podium used for addressing the main ballroom through the integrated audio system. The moment the door closed, the artificial bravado masking the sheer panic of my former family instantly evaporated. They were trapped in a transparent box suspended 42 stories above San Francisco, surrounded by hostile billionaires. Chloe was the first to completely break. The arrogant, superficial confidence she had carried through the airport had entirely disintegrated. She looked at the severe, unyielding lines of my tailored designer suit, then looked down at her cheap sequined dress, and the reality of the wealth disparity hit her like a physical blow. Her face crumpled. She did not bother to maintain any semblance of professional dignity. She threw herself forward, stopping just short of grabbing my hands, and unleashed a torrent of desperate theatrical tears. "Maya, you have to help us." Chloe sobbed, her voice echoing loudly in the acoustically perfect room. The tears streaming down her face were a spectacular display of calculated, weaponized emotion. "I cannot go back to that miserable life in Atlanta. You know how hard things have been for us. You are a billionaire now. You run this entire massive empire. You have more money and power than we could ever even imagine. I need a job, Maya. I need a high-level marketing position in your company. I know I have no experience in financial technology, but I am a fast learner. I can be a senior director. You can just create a role for me. We are family, Maya. Family helps family. You cannot just leave us drowning when you have the power to save us with a single phone call. I stared at her, my expression completely unchanged. The staggering entitlement radiating from her tear-stained face was almost clinical in its pathology. She had spent years mocking my intelligence, laughing at my ambitions, and actively participating in my isolation. Now she stood in a room overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge, crying fake tears and demanding an executive position in a company I had built from the dirt, simply because she shared blood with the man who had tried to destroy me. She genuinely believed that her manufactured sorrow was a valid currency. I did not offer her a tissue. I did not offer her a single word of comfort. I simply let her desperate echoing sobs hang in the cold, sterile air until the silence became absolutely unbearable. Beatrice, sensing the catastrophic failure of Chloe's emotional manipulation, decided it was time to deploy the heavy artillery. She stepped forward, physically pushing Chloe aside. She squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, attempting to summon the toxic, suffocating matriarchal authority she had wielded over me in her cramped suburban kitchen 3 years ago. She looked me up and down, her eyes narrowing with a mixture of intense jealousy and profound stubborn denial. She refused to accept that the woman standing before her held absolute power. "A good black woman stands by her man, Maya," Beatrice scolded, her voice dripping with venomous, outdated righteousness. She pointed a sharp, accusing finger at my chest. "You have had your little fun out here in California. You played your little business games and you made some money. But you need to remember where you came from. You took vows before God. You do not just abandon your husband and your family when things get difficult. You need to come home, Maya. You need to pack up whatever this is, come back to Atlanta, and share this blessing with your husband and your family. Andre is the head of the household. He is the man. You are going to sign whatever papers he needs to secure his career, and then you are going to give him his rightful share of this company. That is your duty." The sheer, unadulterated delusion required to stand in a billionaire's private executive lounge and demand that I surrender my entire empire to a failing, incompetent regional sales manager was breathtaking. Beatrice was living in an alternate reality, desperately clinging to a patriarchal hierarchy that I had completely incinerated the day I walked out of their lives. I looked through the glass walls of the lounge. The board members of Apex Ledger were watching the exchange with clinical fascination. They could not hear the words, but they could read the aggressive, desperate body language. They were watching a dying species thrash against the glass. Marcus stepped forward, holding his encrypted tablet. "Ms. Sterling," he said, his voice cutting through the thick, toxic air. "I have the preliminary acquisition audit files ready for your review. We have compiled the complete operational data regarding the target firm's regional management failures." I nodded slowly, keeping my eyes locked on Beatrice's furious face. "Display them on the main monitor, Marcus." Marcus connected his tablet to the massive digital table in the center of the room. "I need you to pull up the specific performance metrics regarding the Southeast Division," I instructed, ensuring my voice was loud enough for Andre to hear every single syllable. "Specifically, display the files labeled Duyen Mao 1 underscore 16.docx and Duyen Mao 2 underscore 16.docx. They contain the raw, unedited financial hemorrhage caused by the current regional leadership. And queue up Duyen Mao 3 underscore 16.docx and Duyen Mao 4 underscore 16.docx immediately after. Those contain the recommended executive termination schedules. The massive screen flared to life, illuminating the dark lounge with harsh, unforgiving white light. The documents appeared, projecting undeniable, irrefutable proof of Andre's complete professional incompetence. The graphs showed plummeting revenue, lost client accounts, and catastrophic operational debt. It was a digital autopsy of his entire career displayed in high definition. Andre stared at the screen, the last remaining color draining from his face. The aggressive, confident posture he had attempted to maintain completely collapsed. He was cornered. The fake charm had failed. The emotional manipulation had failed. The toxic authority had failed. The irrefutable proof of his failure was glowing brightly in the center of the room. Desperation, raw and violent, took complete control of his nervous system. He lunged forward, completely abandoning any remaining pretense of professional decorum. He reached out and aggressively grabbed my left arm, his fingers digging painfully into the tailored wool of my suit sleeve. His face twisted into an ugly, threatening scowl, the mask of the charismatic husband slipping away to reveal the terrified, abusive coward beneath. His voice dropped to a low, vicious, threatening register, vibrating with panic and fury. "You owe me this buyout!" Maya Andre hissed, his breath hot against my face. "You owe me everything. Without me, you never would have pushed yourself to do any of this. I made you who you are. You were nothing before you met me. Now sign the deal, finalize the transition, and save my job before I make a scene and ruin this entire night for you. You are not going to embarrass me in front of these people." I stood perfectly still under the harsh, glaring lights of the digital monitor. I did not pull away. I slowly lowered my gaze, staring down at his heavy hand gripping my sleeve with desperate, violent intensity. The physical touch, once a source of deep anxiety and fear, now registered as nothing more than the pathetic, flailing grasp of a drowning man. He genuinely believed his anger still held power. He believed his physical intimidation could still force my immediate compliance. I looked back up, my eyes meeting his terrified, furious gaze. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the ragged, panicked breathing of his trembling family. I slowly, deliberately raised my right hand and flicked his trembling fingers off my designer sleeve, as if brushing away a piece of insignificant, dirty lint. I did not say a single word to him. I simply turned my back on his desperate, threatening face, leaving him standing in the cold shadow of his own digitally documented failure. I walked with calm, carefully measured steps toward the sleek microphone podium situated perfectly at the center of the glass-walled lounge, preparing to permanently address the entire ballroom, waiting eagerly beyond the transparent barrier. I stepped up to the sleek microphone podium at the center of the VIP lounge. The cool metal beneath my fingertips grounded me against the suffocating heat radiating from the 4 miserable people frozen behind me. I did not rush. I tapped the dark metallic head of the microphone twice. The sharp sound sliced through the advanced audio system, instantly broadcasting across the sprawling grand ballroom outside the glass walls. The effect was immediate. The buzzing hum of corporate networking vanished in a second. Hundreds of powerful industry leaders, venture capitalists, and angel investors ceased their conversations, turning their gaze upward toward the transparent box where I stood. Looking down, I could easily see the regional vice president of the Atlanta firm, the man who blindly forwarded Andre the gala invitation, standing near a caviar station. He was adjusting his silk tie with eager anticipation. He genuinely thought he was about to witness a congratulatory corporate speech praising his company. He had no idea he was about to watch his regional management team get digitally eviscerated. I adjusted the microphone stem, letting the heavy silence stretch out for a few agonizing seconds. I did not raise my voice or allow any emotion to bleed into my tone. I spoke with surgical, terrifying precision. I would like to take this highly anticipated moment to officially welcome the newest addition to our expanding corporate ecosystem. I announced, my voice echoing flawlessly across the imported Italian marble of the grand ballroom. I would like to welcome Andre's firm to the Apex Ledger family. Polite, measured applause rippled through the massive crowd below. The wealthy executives clapped softly, their sharp eyes locked firmly on the glowing glass lounge. Standing directly behind me, I could hear Beatrice let out a shaky breath of relief. For a fleeting fraction of a second, that entire toxic family believed they had magically survived my wrath. They honestly thought my public declaration of the corporate acquisition meant I was willingly playing the role of the benevolent savior they had demanded I be. I let the polite applause run its natural course, quietly watching the smug, arrogant smile slowly attempt to return to Andre's profusely sweating face. He puffed out his chest, desperately trying to project the fabricated image of a victorious, successful executive. He was mentally spending his massive retention bonus again, convinced his manufactured charm had permanently saved him. He was completely wrong. The scattered applause slowly died down, replaced by an intensely attentive, quiet anticipation. I reached smoothly into the concealed interior pocket of my tailored designer suit jacket and withdrew a small, sleek black electronic remote control. I held the device up slightly deliberately, ensuring the subtle gesture was highly visible to the entire crowded room, and then I firmly pressed the primary activation button. The massive projector screen suspended high above the grand ballroom floor did not display the standard triumphant corporate welcome logo that everyone in the room expected to see. Instead, the gigantic screens flared violently to life with raw, unfiltered, brutally damning corporate financial data. I had authorized my aggressive acquisition team to dig incredibly deep into the rotting infrastructure of the dying Atlanta firm, and the horrific results were now broadcast in glowing, undeniable high-resolution detail for every billionaire in Silicon Valley to scrutinize. The central screen prominently displayed Andre's exact, unedited regional sales numbers for the past 36 consecutive months. The primary graph was a steep, jagged red line plunging directly into a catastrophic deficit. Right beside it, a secondary screen instantly populated with his heavily padded, completely fraudulent expense reports, highlighting exorbitant, unauthorized spending on luxury corporate dinners and unnecessary executive travel that generated absolutely zero revenue. The third giant screen illuminated his hidden corporate debts and his abysmal, embarrassing quarterly performance metrics. The displayed data was a clinical, entirely public autopsy of a weak man who was entirely unqualified for his prestigious position, a lazy man who had spent years systematically bleeding his parent company dry while projecting a completely fabricated image of immense success. The absolute silence in the grand ballroom was no longer polite or professionally expectant. It was the incredibly suffocating silence of collective corporate shock. The venture capitalists and my ruthless board members stared up at the massive glowing screens, their professional curiosity rapidly transforming into sheer disgust and utter contempt. They possessed absolutely zero tolerance for the kind of bloated, pathetic incompetence currently glowing brightly above their heads. I watched the regional vice president of the Atlanta firm physically recoil in sheer horror, his face completely draining of color as he stared directly at the undeniable mathematical proof of his own massive failure in executive oversight. He was looking at the exact numbers that proved his lead regional sales manager was a complete, total fraud. The brutal public humiliation was absolute and surgically executed without a single drop of spilled blood. Inside the glass lounge, the emotional atmosphere violently shifted from fragile relief to sheer blinding terror. Chloe let out a sharp, genuine gasp, covering her open mouth with shaking hands as she stared at the giant digital screens exposing her older brother's financial ruin. Beatrice stumbled backward in absolute shock, bumping against the expensive leather sofa, her weak legs completely giving out. Julian stood frozen like a miserable statue, realizing the lucrative coattails he intended to ride belonged to a pathetic man being aggressively incinerated on a corporate pyre. Andre was practically vibrating with a chaotic, uncontrollable mixture of absolute panic and blind fury. The tight muscles in his clenched jaw ticked violently, and his sweaty hands curled into tight, aggressively trembling fists at his sides. The charismatic mask was entirely, permanently gone. He was nothing more than a cornered, deeply terrified animal, helplessly watching his entire, fabricated reality burn completely to the ground in front of the most powerful, influential people in the country. He looked frantically at the glowing screens, then looked down in absolute horror at his furious corporate bosses, and finally his crazed, desperate eyes locked directly onto the back of my head. I absolutely did not turn around to face his pathetic meltdown. I kept my cold gaze fixed squarely on the silent, completely captivated crowd standing below, continuously projecting an aura of total, unshakable command. The atmosphere in the massive room was electric, loudly crackling with the dangerous, highly thrilling energy of a perfectly executed public corporate execution. I leaned slightly closer to the brushed steel microphone, calmly preparing to deliver the final lethal strike. We are officially absorbing the company's regional assets, its highly valuable structural data centers, and its incredibly active client ecosystem. I announced, my voice smoothly slicing through the dead-heavy silence of the ballroom, like a polished razor-sharp steel blade. The crisp words echoed beautifully off the imported marble floors and the soaring glass windows, permanently finalizing the aggressive predatory acquisition in real time. However, I continued, deliberately pausing for a perfectly calculated fraction of a second to let the intense, crushing tension stretch to its absolute, agonizing breaking point. We will absolutely not be retaining the current management structure. We will be liquidating Andre's entire department immediately due to gross, heavily documented incompetence and completely catastrophic regional financial mismanagement. The brutal declaration rang out with absolute, unquestionable, devastating finality. It was absolutely not a polite negotiation. It was a direct, highly targeted, completely merciless professional annihilation. I had just publicly fired him, completely disgraced his name, and permanently rendered him unemployable in the modern financial sector, all while standing securely behind a microphone in my own multi-billion-dollar corporate fortress. The sheer weight of the absolute destruction finally broke whatever fragile restraints Andre had left in his mind. His sweating face turned a deep, mottled shade of violent purple. The thick veins in his neck dangerously bulged against his tight tuxedo collar, pulsing rapidly with blinding rage. He simply could not accept the undeniable defeat. His toxic narcissism completely refused to allow his ego to die quietly. He completely lost his fragile grip on reality. He violently shoved past his openly weeping mother and his totally paralyzed older brother, aggressively throwing his entire desperate body weight directly against the heavy glass door of the private VIP lounge. The thick door swung open violently, forcefully crashing against the exterior structural wall with a loud ringing thud that echoed sharply across the completely silent ballroom. He stepped recklessly out onto the elevated glass landing, exposing his sweaty, panicked self to the staring crowd of powerful industry leaders and his own horrified corporate superiors. He leaned dangerously over the polished glass railing, his chest rapidly heaving with ragged, frantic breaths, and unleashed a desperate, totally unhinged scream that violently tore through the quiet room. "You absolutely cannot do this!" he roared loudly, his voice cracking with sheer pathetic desperation and absolutely impotent fury. "We are still legally married in the state of Georgia. I legally own exactly 1/2 of everything you just built." The echo of his desperate scream bounced off the vaulted glass ceiling and rolled across the silent ballroom. Hundreds of powerful investors, venture capitalists, and industry titans stared up at the elevated VIP lounge in absolute shock. Andre stood gripping the glass railing, his chest heaving, his face a terrifying mask of purple rage and terminal panic. He had just declared war on a billionaire CEO in front of her entire corporate empire, clinging to the only weapon he thought he had left. He thought he owned me. He thought the legal chains of our past could magically bind my current empire to his sinking ship. I did not flinch at his scream. I did not raise my voice to match his chaotic, unhinged frequency. The power in the room belonged entirely to me, and true power never needs to shout. I stepped up to the microphone, adjusting the sleek metal stem with slow, deliberate precision. I looked down at the crowd, letting my gaze sweep over the horrified faces of the Atlanta Regional Management Team, and then I looked directly at Andre. I signaled my lead corporate attorney, David, to step forward out of the shadows directly behind me. David was a legal shark who specialized in destroying predatory claims, and he held a digital remote in his steady hand. I gave him a single subtle nod. David pressed a button, and the massive projector screen suspended above the ballroom shifted instantly. The graphs detailing Andre's professional incompetence vanished. In their place, a stark, undeniable legal document illuminated the entire room. The official seal of the state of Georgia was stamped clearly at the top. The bright white text on the massive screen highlighted the final, irrevocable judgment. I leaned into the microphone to deliver the absolute, undeniable truth. "We aren't married, Andre." My voice sliced through the heavy silence with surgical, terrifying precision. The words echoed perfectly across the imported marble floor. The divorce was finalized 2.5 years ago through a default judgment. Andre stared at the glowing screen, his mouth opening and closing wordlessly. The thick veins in his neck throbbed. He shook his head frantically, looking back at his mother Beatrice, who had gone completely pale, clutching her knockoff handbag against her chest as if trying to protect her own failing heart. Julian and Chloe stood entirely frozen in the dark lounge corner. "Because you ignored the abandonment summons, assuming I would come crawling back to your miserable suburban rental begging for forgiveness, the court granted my petition in full. You threw the legal notices in the trash. You ignored the certified letters because your toxic ego convinced you that I could never survive without your permission. Because you completely ignored the legal process, you forfeited every single right you thought you possessed. You have absolutely no legal standing, no marital claim, and zero right to a single cent of this corporation." The realization hit him like a physical blow to his sweating stomach. His knees buckled slightly, but his desperate grip on the glass railing kept him upright. The fabricated wealth his family had celebrated on the flight was completely dead. But I didn't stop there. The execution required total annihilation. "You are standing in my building making aggressive demands for executive positions and corporate payouts," I stated, turning my attention to Chloe, who immediately shrank backward. "You preach about family loyalty while demanding I hand over a massive fortune to a man who literally threw my suitcase into the dirt. But the absolute truth of your situation is much, much darker." I turned back to David and gave him another slight nod. I had anticipated Andre might attempt to cause a chaotic scene. I had prepared the ultimate countermeasure during the initial stages of the corporate acquisition audit. When you acquire a failing company, you dig through their financial records with a fine-tooth comb. What my forensic accounting team uncovered during the acquisition audit was nothing short of spectacular. David pressed the remote again. The divorce decree vanished from the massive screens, instantly replaced by a complex, highly detailed web of massive corporate bank transfers and totally unauthorized vendor invoices. The data was beautifully organized, tracing the flow of stolen capital with devastating clarity. I projected the forensic accounting files for every single billionaire in the room to scrutinize. "This is a complete financial profile of the Atlanta division over the last 12 months," I announced to the silent, captivated ballroom. "When we audited your branch, we noticed several severe financial discrepancies. Money was constantly bleeding out of the operational budget through ghost vendors and heavily manipulated expense reports." Andre let out a strangled, desperate gasp. He lunged away from the glass railing, violently stumbling forward toward the massive digital table in the center of the room, as if he could physically wipe the damning evidence off the screens. But the data was untouchable, glaring down at him from above. "It proves Andre had been embezzling company funds to cover Julian and Chloe luxury lifestyle over the last year," I declared, my voice echoing like thunder. "You siphoned retention bonuses and forged client entertainment receipts to cover the massive debts your parasitic family generated." I pointed directly at the screen, highlighting Julian's full name. The data showed thousands of dollars transferred to cover Julian's terribly failed business ventures and extremely overdue rent. The stolen funds were cleverly disguised as external consulting fees. Julian took a sharp step back, his eyes darting frantically toward the door, suddenly realizing he was deeply implicated in a major corporate crime. I shifted my gaze to Chloe. "And you," I added, my tone dripping with icy contempt. "You demanded a senior marketing position tonight. Yet the audit proves Andre was paying off your luxury credit cards and funding your extensive shopping habits using the corporate regional marketing budget. Every single designer item you are currently wearing was essentially stolen from the company I purchased. Chloe let out a pathetic, high-pitched whine, covering her face with her hands. The wealthy investors standing on the ballroom floor began to murmur the quiet hum of absolute disgust rippling through the elite crowd. They were witnessing a masterclass in corporate destruction. Andre was not just a terrible manager. He was a documented thief who had dragged his accomplices directly into the spotlight. Beatrice tried to intervene, her toxic maternal instincts desperately trying to shield her golden child from the firing squad. "This is a mistake," she cried out, her voice shaking violently as she quickly stepped directly toward the microphone podium. "My son is a good man. You are twisting the numbers to make him look bad because you are bitter. You are just a bitter, vindictive woman trying to ruin his blessing." I looked at Beatrice with complete, total indifference. "The numbers do not lie, Beatrice. Your son is a criminal, and you have been happily eating the fruits of his crimes while pretending to be superior. The illusion is permanently over." I turned my attention away from the pathetic, crumbling family inside the glass lounge and looked directly down at the main grand ballroom floor. I looked directly at his boss, who was standing in the front row, completely horrified, sweating through his expensive tailored shirt. He was the regional vice president who had blindly trusted Andre, the man who had forwarded the gala invitation without performing a single background check. He was staring up at the massive screens, realizing his own career was likely collateral damage in this explosive scandal. "We are completely absorbing the legitimate assets of your company," I announced, addressing the regional vice president directly. "The structural framework is sound, and the regional client ecosystem will integrate perfectly smoothly into our Apex ledger. However, as the new owner of this enterprise, I am legally obligated to address the massive financial crimes committed under your direct supervision." The regional vice president swallowed hard, nodding rapidly, eager to signal his complete compliance and distance himself from the toxic wreckage standing inside the VIP lounge. Andre was hyperventilating now. He realized the walls had completely closed in. He had no job, he had no marriage, he had no leverage whatsoever. He was standing in a cheap rented tuxedo, completely surrounded by the irrefutable digital proof of his own massive corruption and terrible financial theft. He looked at me, tears of sheer panic welling in his red, bloodshot eyes. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg, perhaps to try and manipulate his way out of the slaughterhouse using the same tired, empty promises he had used for years. I did not give him the chance to utter a single pathetic syllable. I gripped the very edges of the sleek metal podium and delivered the final devastating blow with absolute, totally chilling authority. If he tries to sue me for assets, he won't get a dime. He will go to federal prison for corporate fraud. The word prison hung in the chilled, perfectly conditioned air of the glass lounge like a physical executioner's blade swinging downward. The absolute, unshakable finality of my statement severed the very last thread of Andre's manufactured bravado. His mouth opened and closed in rapid, silent spasms, completely devoid of the arrogant venom he had spewed just seconds prior. He looked frantically at David, my lead corporate attorney, who simply adjusted his tailored suit jacket with clinical, merciless indifference. David did not even need to speak. The glowing digital screens projecting the massive, undeniable embezzlement files did all the necessary communicating. The reality of his absolute destruction finally penetrated the thick, toxic layers of Andre's monumental narcissism. He was not going to walk away with half of my empire. He was going to walk away in handcuffs. The regional vice president, standing outside on the main ballroom floor, had already turned his back, furiously typing on his encrypted mobile device, undoubtedly initiating the immediate corporate termination protocols and alerting the federal authorities. Andre was officially a corporate pariah, a radioactive liability that no executive in Silicon Valley would ever touch again. The suffocating silence inside the VIP lounge was suddenly violently shattered, not by Andre, but by the rapidly deteriorating accomplices he had dragged into his catastrophic downfall. The unified aggressive front my former abusers had maintained for years instantly spectacularly disintegrated under the crushing, undeniable weight of federal fraud implications. The parasitic loyalty they shared was built entirely on a foundation of stolen money and fabricated superiority. Now that the money was gone, and the superiority was exposed as a pathetic criminal illusion, they immediately turned their sharp, venomous fangs on each other like starving animals trapped inside a collapsing cage. Chloe backed away from the massive digital table as if the glowing financial data might physically burn her. Her eyes were wide with a new, distinct brand of terror. She looked down at her heavily sequined dress, her expensive designer shoes, and the sparkling diamond tennis bracelet she had flauntedly waved in my face at the airport. The realization that every single luxury item she possessed was directly linked to a massive corporate embezzlement scheme completely broke her fragile, superficial mind. She spun around, her face twisting into an ugly mask of sheer panic, and launched herself violently at her older brother. "You told me the money was from his regional bonuses," Chloe shrieked, her voice cracking into a hysterical, unhinged pitch that reverberated sharply against the thick, soundproof glass. "You explicitly told me Andre was just routing his executive compensation through your consulting firm for tax purposes. You dragged me into federal fraud, Julian. My signature is on those account transfers. I am on the board of your fake consulting company. I am not going to federal prison for your pathetic failed business schemes. I will tell the authorities everything. I will tell them you orchestrated the entire transfer structure." Julian physically recoiled from her, his own face draining of any remaining color. The smug, condescending older brother, who had spent years mocking my career trajectory, was now sweating profusely, terrified of his own sister. "Shut your mouth," Chloe Julian hissed aggressively, grabbing her by the shoulders and giving her a harsh, desperate shake. "You happily spent every single dime he funneled to us. You never once questioned where the massive influx of cash came from when you needed your luxury car payments covered. Do not pretend you are some innocent victim now. You are just as guilty as we are, and if I go down for this corporate fraud, I am taking you right down with me." Their vicious, screaming argument echoed through the pristine executive lounge, a disgusting, pathetic display of mutual self-destruction. They were completely ignoring the hundreds of powerful industry titans watching their grotesque meltdown from the main ballroom floor. They were entirely consumed by the terrifying prospect of losing their freedom, their status, and their stolen wealth. I watched their spectacular implosion with absolute chilling detachment. They were finally experiencing the exact same suffocating, inescapable terror they had inflicted upon me for 4 miserable years. Beatrice realized with horrifying clarity that her entire family structure was completely disintegrating. Her golden child was facing federal incarceration. Her older son and her fiercely spoiled daughter were viciously tearing each other apart over wire fraud implications. The endless stream of stolen corporate wealth that had funded her arrogant, comfortable suburban lifestyle was permanently severed. Her manufactured social standing among her country club peers was about to be obliterated by a massive, highly public criminal scandal. She needed a new anchor, a new victim to manipulate, and her desperate, calculating eyes instantly locked onto me. The grand matriarch completely abandoned the toxic, demanding authority she had attempted to wield just moments earlier. Her rigid posture instantly collapsed, replaced by the hunched, trembling frame of a deeply frightened, helpless old woman. She forced a torrential flood of performative, theatrical tears to stream down her heavily powdered cheeks. She let out a loud, pathetic wail that momentarily drowned out the vicious screaming match between Julian and Chloe. She stumbled blindly across the sleek marble floor, completely disregarding the intense warning glare from my private security detail. Before Marcus could physically intercept her, Beatrice threw herself forward violently, grabbing my right hand with both of her trembling, sweaty palms. Her grip was desperate, sticky, and entirely repulsive. "Maya, please," Beatrice sobbed, looking up at me with wide, pleading eyes that were entirely devoid of genuine remorse. "You cannot do this to us. You cannot send my boys to a federal penitentiary. We are your family. I know we had our difficult moments in the past, but I always loved you. You are like a daughter to me. Please, I am begging you to show us some mercy. Just cancel the audit and let us walk away." I stared down at her hands, frantically clutching mine. The sheer, blinding hypocrisy of her statement was almost physically sickening. The woman who had treated me like an uneducated servant who had actively encouraged her son to diminish and control me was now weeping at my feet, demanding the very grace she had explicitly denied me. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of anger. I slowly, forcefully pulled my hand out of her desperate, clinging grasp. My expression hardened into an impenetrable mask of pure titanium. "You told me to find my own way back," I replied coldly, my voice ringing with absolute unyielding finality. "I did." Beatrice physically recoiled, as if I had struck her directly across the face. She stumbled backward, her mouth hanging open in absolute silent horror, finally understanding that her lifelong mastery of emotional manipulation held absolutely zero power over me. She crumpled onto the expensive leather sofa, burying her weeping face in her hands, completely defeated. The spectacular collapse of his mother, combined with the vicious, ongoing screaming match between his siblings, finally shattered the very last defensive barrier inside Andre's mind. He stood completely paralyzed in the center of the transparent VIP lounge, utterly stripped of his corporate power, his lucrative job, and his fragile, entirely fabricated dignity. He looked at the screens projecting his criminal embezzlement. He looked at the powerful executives outside pointing and whispering about his highly public execution. He looked at the family he illegally funded tearing themselves to shreds. And finally, he looked at me, the untouchable architect of his annihilation. The realization that I had orchestrated every single second of this elaborate, devastating trap hit him with the crushing force of a freight train. He realized that the quiet, submissive woman he had mercilessly bullied had meticulously planned his absolute destruction with cold, calculating precision. The overwhelming terror completely robbed him of his physical strength. His legs violently trembled beneath his cheap rented tuxedo. He let out a pathetic, strangled gasp, a sound stripped of masculine pride. And then, in the very middle of the opulent, brilliantly illuminated glass lounge, in full view of the most powerful billionaires and venture capitalists in the entire country, Andre completely collapsed. He dropped heavily to his knees, the sharp impact echoing loudly across the imported Italian marble floor. He did not try to stand back up. He did not try to maintain any semblance of professional decorum or personal pride. He stayed on his knees, staring up at me with a face completely ravaged by absolute blinding terror and profound, undeniable despair. His arrogant empire was dead. His stolen wealth was gone. His freedom was entirely dependent on a federal investigation I had personally initiated. He clasped his trembling hands together, pressing them tightly against his chest, in a gesture of absolute pathetic surrender. He completely ignored his weeping mother and his screaming siblings. He kept his desperate, broken gaze locked firmly on my face, preparing to beg for a salvation that would absolutely never come. Andre remained kneeling on the cold marble, his face tilted upward in a mask of absolute desperation. Tears streamed down his bloated cheeks, ruining the arrogant swagger he had walked into the building with. He pressed his palms together, babbling a pathetic stream of broken apologies and hollow promises. He swore he would change his life. He swore the embezzlement was a desperate mistake. He swore we could rebuild everything if I gave him one single chance to explain his side of the story. The sheer volume of his begging was staggering, echoing against the glass walls of the VIP lounge. 3 years ago, the sight of this man raising his voice would have sent a paralyzing jolt of pure terror straight down my spine. I would have instantly folded inward frantically, trying to placate his unpredictable ego, terrified of the explosive rage that followed his demands. I looked down at his trembling frame now, searching my own chest for even a microscopic fraction of sympathy or lingering attachment. There was absolutely nothing. The internal void where my fear used to live was entirely filled with cold, impenetrable titanium. There would be no tearful hug. There would be no dramatic reconciliation. There would be no whisper of forgiveness to soothe his shattered ego. I did not owe this man redemption. I owed him exactly what he had given me when he threw me out of my own home. Nothing. I shifted my gaze away from his weeping face, stripping him of the validation he so desperately craved. I looked directly at Marcus, who was standing perfectly still, patiently waiting for the final execution order. My private security detail, 2 towering men in dark suits, had already stepped inside the transparent enclosure, their physical presence radiating a silent threat. I did not raise my voice or allow a single ounce of anger to color my tone. I spoke with the flat, emotionless efficiency of a machine discarding obsolete hardware. Marcus, I said, gesturing smoothly toward the trembling cluster of weeping figures occupying the center of my executive lounge. Please instruct the security team to escort these former employees out of my building immediately. Do not allow them to collect any personal items. Confiscate their temporary vendor badges right now. They are permanently banned from entering all Apex Ledger properties globally. If they attempt to physically resist or cause any secondary disturbance, authorize the guards to use whatever physical force is deemed legally necessary to remove the threat. The guards moved with terrifying synchronized speed. One guard grabbed Andre by his tuxedo collar and hauled him to his feet, ignoring his desperate yelps of protest. Andre's legs were shaking so violently he could barely support his weight, forcing the guard to practically drag him across the smooth marble floor. The second guard stepped aggressively toward Julian and Chloe. Julian threw his hands into the air in a frantic gesture of surrender, backing away from his screaming sister. Chloe was crying hysterically, her mascara running down her cheeks in thick, ugly streaks, ruining her contoured face. The guard grabbed Julian by the bicep, shoving him firmly toward the heavy glass door, then pointed a demanding finger directly at Chloe, issuing a silent command for her to start walking immediately. Beatrice was the very last to move. The fallen matriarch was still slumped heavily on the expensive leather sofa, paralyzed by the absolute destruction of her entire social and financial reality. She looked up at me one final time, her eyes silently begging for a shred of the mercy she had never granted me. She opened her mouth to speak, but the guard stepped into her direct line of sight, blocking her view, and roughly hauled the older woman to her feet. The heavy glass doors of the VIP lounge swung open, breaking the soundproof seal and allowing the ambient noise of the grand ballroom to rush back in. I stood perfectly still, my posture rigid and commanding, unmoving, as I watched the final stage of my meticulously planned execution. The entire massive ballroom, filled with the absolute elite of the Silicon Valley financial technology sector, watched in total silence as the horrific scene unfolded. Andre, Julian, Chloe, and Beatrice were physically marched out of the transparent lounge and paraded directly across the center of the sprawling, brightly illuminated floor. It was a spectacular, deeply humiliating march of corporate death. Hundreds of powerful billionaires and ruthless board members stared at them with naked disgust. The attendees naturally parted, creating a wide, isolating aisle of polished marble, completely refusing to let the disgraced employees brush against their expensive clothing. Andre kept his head down, sobbing audibly as the security guard forcefully marched him toward the main exit doors. The devastating reality of his situation was absolute. He was utterly humiliated in front of the high society he had desperately craved to join. He was entirely destitute, his lucrative salary terminated, and his stolen assets frozen by the acquisition audit. He was facing immediate federal criminal investigations for corporate embezzlement and systemic wire fraud. His entire life was legally over. Julian and Chloe walked slightly behind him, entirely consumed by the terrifying knowledge that they were heavily implicated in their brother's financial crimes. They were going to spend the next decade drowning in aggressive federal subpoenas and devastating legal fees. Beatrice, the dictatorial woman, who had constantly mocked my intelligence and demanded my absolute subservience, stumbled blindly toward the elevators, looking like a broken shadow of a human being. She had permanently lost her golden child's lucrative meal ticket. She had lost her fabricated social standing among her shallow suburban friends. She had lost absolutely everything she valued in the world. I watched them step into the waiting elevator, the heavy steel doors sliding shut, permanently severing them from my universe. They were cast out into the cold San Francisco fog. They were left exactly where they had left me 3 agonizing years ago. They were stranded in the dark with absolutely nothing, and they had no way back. I turned my back to the heavy glass doors of the executive lounge, completely dismissing their existence from my mind forever. The toxic weight of the past 3 years finally evaporated from my shoulders, leaving behind a sensation of incredible blinding lightness. The immediate corporate atmosphere inside the VIP lounge instantly shifted. The violent tension dissipated, replaced by the crackling electric energy of massive financial victory. Marcus stepped forward, his face breaking into a wide, genuinely thrilled smile. He handed me a crystal flute filled with expensive vintage sparkling champagne, silently congratulating me on the flawless, bloodless execution of the hostile corporate takeover. I accepted the delicate glass, the cool crystal grounding me in the absolute reality of my current untouchable power. A tall, striking man in a flawlessly tailored charcoal suit stepped smoothly into the VIP lounge, bypassing the security detail with effortless, practiced authority. It was Elias, my brilliant co-founder, and the lead architect of our primary encryption software. He possessed a quiet, steady confidence that never required him to dominate the room or diminish the people standing around him. He was a genuinely supportive intellectual, equal a man who actively celebrated my fierce ambition rather than desperately trying to extinguish it. He stepped up directly beside me, his presence a warm, solid, comforting anchor in the center of the massive corporate storm. He looked at the empty elevator bank at the far end of the ballroom, then looked down at my face, a soft, knowing smile playing on his lips. "The trash has been successfully taken out," Elias murmured quietly, his deep voice carrying a tone of absolute, unwavering support and genuine affection. I looked up at him, allowing a genuine, relaxed smile to finally break across my face. "Yes, it has," I replied smoothly. "And the structural integration of the newly acquired Southeast Division begins at exactly 8 o'clock tomorrow morning." Elias softly clinked his crystal champagne flute against mine. "To the absolute future, Maya," he said, taking a slow sip of the expensive vintage. "To the future," I echoed, the taste of the champagne crisp and sweet on my tongue. I turned my gaze away from the crowded ballroom and looked out through the massive windows of the Transamerica Pyramid. The dense white fog had completely cleared from the bay, revealing the spectacular, glittering expanse of the San Francisco skyline. I stood at the zenith of the city, surrounded by dedicated colleagues who deeply respected my intellect and absolute corporate authority. I had built a massive, untouchable empire from the ashes of my past. I had systematically dismantled the cruel, parasitic monsters who had desperately tried to bury me. I took another sip of champagne, feeling the cold, sparkling liquid slide down my throat. The air in the penthouse lounge was clean, pristine, and clear. I felt a profound sense of absolute peace settle deep into my bones. I was finally completely and permanently free.